Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. Have you ever looked at a photograph and felt like it held a secret you couldn't quite unlock? One that seemed to reach beyond the simple moment it captured? I never thought much about it until I found that photograph. It all started when I was cleaning out my grandmother's attic. She had passed away recently, and the house had been left to me. It was a familiar place to me, one full of memories. The smell of old wood and dust, the creak of the floorboards, all the things that I had known since I was a child. But that day, as I sifted through boxes of forgotten trinkets and yellowed pages, I stumbled upon something I wasn't expecting, a family album. My grandmother's album, worn at the edges, but still intact. I sat down in the attic, surrounded by piles of old books and dusty furniture, and began flipping through the pages. The faces in the photographs were mostly unfamiliar to me. Relatives I had never met, distant ancestors with names I'd only heard in stories. But then, I came across one photo that stopped me cold. It was a picture of a small, rustic house, the kind you might find on the edge of a village, surrounded by dense trees. The house had a certain charm to it, with ivy creeping up its walls and a red roof that looked as if it had been there for centuries. It was an image that felt oddly familiar, even though I was sure I had never seen it before. The photograph was dated from several years ago, but that wasn't the part that made my heart skip a beat. On the back of the photo, someone had written a note, visited on July 14, 2023. I stared at the date, confused. My mind raced. I had just been there, just a week ago. I had visited that house, tucked away in a quiet corner of the countryside. I'd gone on a spontaneous trip to the location, driven by a strange urge to see it for myself. It was a place I had never heard of before, yet there I was, standing in front of it, just days ago. But the photo? It had been taken long before I even knew the house existed. How could this be? How could this photograph, taken years before my trip, have appeared in my grandmother's album, placed in a time when I hadn't even visited yet? My pulse quickened as I turned the page. But the unease didn't stop there. I flipped to another photo, and this time, my stomach dropped. It was another image of the same house. This time, however, the view was different. The trees around the house were darker, the sky more foreboding. The entire scene felt wrong, like it was hiding something beneath its surface. The date on this photograph read August 2nd, 2023. I hadn't even heard of this place on August 2nd. I couldn't have. I had never visited it then, nor did I even know it existed. But the picture was there, as clear as day, as if it had been waiting for me to find it. A chill ran down my spine. Was it a coincidence? Or was it something more? Something that couldn't be explained by logic or reason? I tried to push the feeling aside. It was impossible to believe that I had somehow traveled back in time, or that the photographs could have been placed there for some other reason. But the feeling, that gnawing unease, wouldn't go away. It hung in the air like the thick dust around me. I had to know more. I needed to understand what was happening, why those photographs had appeared in my grandmother's album when I had just seen the house myself. What was the connection? As I stared at the images, a thought crossed my mind. Maybe the house held some sort of memory, some kind of forgotten history that was trying to reach out to me. Perhaps it wasn't just a place that was important, but something deeper, something buried beneath the surface. A feeling, a memory, or a warning. The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that I had to go back there. I couldn't let this feeling go, not until I understood what it all meant. There was something in that house, something that was linked to the photographs. And I was determined to find out what it was, even if it meant facing the unknown. The next morning, I packed a bag and set out again. The house was still fresh in my mind, its image burned into my memory. But as I drove through the winding roads, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavier, the trees seemed to loom closer, and the path to the house felt like it was taking longer than it had before. When I arrived at the house, it was exactly as I remembered. Nothing had changed. The ivy still clung to the walls, the red roof still stood firm against the sky. But there was an unsettling stillness in the air. It was as if the place was waiting for me. I walked up to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. And as I reached for the handle, I realized that I was no longer sure what I would find inside. Would it be the same house I had visited before? Or had I stepped into something else entirely? I turned the handle, the door creaking open with a sound that echoed in the silence. What lay behind it was something I could never have prepared myself for. The door opened with a soft groan, revealing the dimly lit interior of the house. The air inside was thick with dust and the scent of old wood. It felt colder than it should have been, as if the house had been abandoned for much longer than I remembered. I stepped inside, my footsteps barely audible against the creaking floorboards. The silence was oppressive, as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I had been here only a week ago, but it felt like I was walking into a place that had been untouched for years. The furniture was exactly as I remembered, an old rocking chair by the window, a worn-out couch with faded cushions, and an antique lamp casting a dim glow over the room. Yet, despite the familiarity, something felt wrong. The air felt heavier now, laden with a strange energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stood in the middle of the room, feeling a sudden unease that I couldn't explain. The photographs, those haunting images I had found in my grandmother's album, came rushing back to my mind. The house in those pictures felt different, more vivid, as if it had been frozen in time, waiting for me to uncover its secrets. I walked slowly through the house, my eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. But as I passed through the hall, something caught my attention. A door at the far end of the corridor. It was slightly ajar, something I didn't recall from my previous visit. I hesitated for a moment, the hairs on my arms standing on end. The house felt like it was drawing me toward it, as if it was hiding something just beyond that door. I approached cautiously, my pulse quickening with every step. The door creaked open further as I pushed it, revealing a small room that I didn't recognize. It was empty, except for a single object in the center of the room, a wooden chair. The chair was old, its surface scratched and worn, as though it had been used for years. But it was the object resting on the chair that made my heart stop. It was a photograph, my photograph. I approached it, my hands trembling as I reached down to pick it up. The image was of me, standing in front of this very house. The same house that had seemed so familiar to me, yet now felt as though it had become a prison, holding me captive in its eerie grip. But the photograph was different from any I had ever seen. It was taken in the same place, but the date was wrong. It read, October 1st, 2023. I froze. The date was impossible. I was standing here in that moment, and the photo had been taken after I had already visited the house once. How could this be? How could the photo have appeared here, in this room, showing a future I hadn't lived yet? The room seemed to close in on me. The walls felt like they were leaning closer, and the air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. My breath quickened, and my mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was something far more unsettling. The house, the photographs, the dates, they were all connected. But how? I turned the photograph over, desperate for some sort of explanation, but there was nothing on the back. No name, no date, no message. Just the haunting image of me standing in front of the house, as if I had already been here in a time that hadn't come yet. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a lamp as I tried to steady myself. My mind was spinning. I had to get out. I had to leave this place before I lost my grip on reality entirely. But as I turned toward the door, I heard something. A soft creaking sound, like footsteps. But there was no one there. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty, still, silent. But the sound, it had come from behind me, just beyond the door. I hesitated for a moment, the fear coursing through my veins. Was it my imagination? Or was someone, watching me? I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to leave. I quickly made my way toward the door, my footsteps echoing through the silent house. But as I reached the doorway, I saw it, something I hadn't noticed before. A small, faded photograph, tucked into the corner of the frame. I reached for it, and as I held it up, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The photo was of the same house, but this time there was a figure standing in the doorway. A shadowy figure, its face obscured, its form barely distinguishable. And beneath the figure, written in fading ink, was a single word. Waiting. My breath caught in my throat. I knew, deep down, that I wasn't alone in this house. I wasn't alone, and I wasn't just visiting. I had been here before, in a time that hadn't yet arrived. I was a part of something that was still unfolding, something that had already been set in motion long before I had even stepped foot in this place. I had to leave. I had to escape before it was too late. But the house wouldn't let me go. It had already claimed me, and now there was no way out. I turned, but the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. The room around me began to shift, the familiar walls warping and bending as if the house itself was alive, its very structure changing in response to my panic. And then I heard it. A voice. Soft. Whispers. Calling my name. Come closer. The house was waiting. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the room. I could feel them crawling under my skin, winding their way into my thoughts. It was as if the house itself was alive, its voice a dark presence that filled every corner. My heart pounded in my chest, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. I tried to move, but my legs felt like they were made of stone, my feet rooted to the floor. The door had slammed shut behind me, trapping me in this twisted version of the house. I could feel my pulse racing as I scanned the room for any way out, but there was nothing. The shadows were too deep, the air too heavy. Come closer. The voice was clear now, not just a whisper, but a command. It wasn't my own thoughts, no matter how much they seemed to echo in my mind. It was something else, something that wanted me to obey. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I forced my legs to move. I turned, stumbling toward the door, hoping against hope that I could escape this nightmare. But as I reached for the doorknob, it began to twist and bend. The metal groaned under an unseen force, distorting as if it were made of wax, warping with a mind of its own. I pulled my hand away, terrified, but then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The photograph in my hand. The one with the shadowy figure. It had changed. The figure was closer now. Its outline was sharper, more defined. I could make out its features, its eyes, empty and hollow, its mouth twisted into a grin that stretched far too wide. The photograph was no longer static. The figure in the doorway seemed to shift, as if it were slowly moving toward me. I dropped the photograph in horror, backing away, my breath shallow and panicked. It couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. I had to get out. I had to leave this place before it consumed me, before the house swallowed me whole like it had done to whoever, whatever, was in that photograph. The house groaned again, a deep, unsettling sound that vibrated through the walls. The floor beneath me trembled, as though the very foundation was cracking, shifting. The whispers, once faint, were now deafening, coming from every direction. I couldn't escape them. They were in my ears, in my mind, calling me, beckoning me closer to the thing in the photograph, the thing waiting just beyond the door. And then it happened. The door that had once been sealed shut began to open, slowly, with an unnatural creak. At first, I thought it was a trick of my mind, the result of my panic. But no! The door was opening, inch by inch, revealing nothing but darkness beyond it. I didn't know if I could go any further. The very thought of stepping into that darkness made my skin crawl, but I had no choice. The house was pulling me in, dragging me toward it. The door was no longer a way out. It was the only way forward. I took a deep breath and stepped toward it, my mind screaming for me to turn back, but my body moving against my will. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, urging me on. "Come closer," they whispered. "You've always been here." With each step, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. My surroundings blurred, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was still in the house or if I had somehow crossed into another place entirely. A place where time had no meaning, where the rules of reality no longer applied. As I reached the threshold of the door, something inside me broke. The whispers turned into a chant, a rhythmic, hypnotic sound that filled my head. I felt like I was losing myself, my identity slipping away, like I was becoming one with the house, with the shadows, with the thing in the photograph. And then I saw it. The figure from the photograph was standing right in front of me, its hollow eyes staring directly at me. It was no longer confined to the image, it was here, in this place, in the same room, just a few feet away. It was real, and it was waiting. I froze. There was no escape now. The figure reached out, its cold, skeletal hand brushing against my cheek. The touch was electric, sending a shock of icy fear through my body. I could feel its presence, its essence, moving through me, intertwining with my thoughts. "You're here now," it whispered, its voice a rasping hiss in my ear. "You've always been here." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The figure's grin widened, stretching impossibly far, and its eyes glowed with a sickly light, as though they were burning with an ancient, malevolent fire. The photograph, the one I had dropped on the floor, was now in my hand again. The shadowy figure was staring at me, its grin even wider, as if it were waiting for something. As if it knew what was going to happen next. And then, I understood. I had never left. The photograph wasn't just a snapshot of a moment, it was a record of something that had already happened. I wasn't in the house anymore. I was part of it. The house, the photographs, the whispers, they were all connected, all part of the same twisted loop. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was consumed by the darkness. And in the silence, the whispers continued. You've always been here. The darkness was all-encompassing. It swallowed me whole, leaving me with nothing but the faint, uneasy feeling of being watched. I could feel the weight of the air around me, thick with an oppressive presence, as if something ancient and malevolent was breathing down my neck. I was no longer sure where I was, whether I was still in the house, or if I had crossed into some twisted reflection of it, a place that didn't follow the rules of time or reality. I reached out in the dark, my hands shaking uncontrollably, searching for something to hold on to. But there was nothing. Just the cold, empty space pressing in from all sides. The more I moved, the more I felt like I was being pulled deeper, as if the darkness itself was alive and had its own intentions for me. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were constant now, a low murmur that surrounded me from all angles, like a swarm of insects in my ears. I couldn't make out the words, but they were there, always there, feeding on my fear, becoming part of my thoughts. You've always been here. The words, though still a whisper, seemed clearer now. I could almost hear them inside my head. And with them came the realization that something was wrong, that this place, whatever it was, didn't just want me to be here. It wanted me to stay. Panic began to rise in my chest, my heart racing as the suffocating feeling of claustrophobia intensified. I needed to get out. I needed to escape, but every direction I turned only seemed to bring me closer to something I couldn't see, something that was patiently waiting for me to understand. I stumbled forward, trying to push through the thick air, but my feet felt heavy, as if the ground itself was pulling at me. The cold was biting now, creeping into my bones, freezing me from the inside out. I couldn't tell if it was the temperature or the fear that was making me shiver so violently. Then, I saw it. A flicker of light in the distance, distant but growing, like the glow of a fading candle. I was drawn to it, instinctively, my body moving toward it without thought. But as I walked, the light seemed to shift, to move away from me, just beyond reach. I pushed harder, forcing my legs to move, driven by an overwhelming need to reach it. The whispering was louder now, more insistent, and I could swear I heard a voice that sounded like my own, tangled with the others. Come closer. I was almost there. My hands reached forward, and I could feel the heat of the light on my skin, almost as if it were alive, reaching out to meet me. But when I finally grasped it, the light vanished, leaving me in total darkness once again. A low laugh echoed around me, a sound that scraped at my nerves, sending a chill down my spine. It wasn't just a sound, it was a sensation, like the very air was laughing at me, mocking my attempts to escape. You're never leaving, the voice said, and this time it wasn't a whisper. It was clear, real, like a presence speaking directly into my mind. You've always been here. I couldn't breathe. The weight of those words crushed me, suffocating me in the dark. I wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but there was nowhere to go. I couldn't tell which direction was up, or where the ground ended and the void began. And then, just when I thought I might lose myself completely to the darkness, I felt something, no, someone, close to me. A presence, just behind me, standing so close I could feel the cold breath on the back of my neck. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. If I did, I was certain I would see it, the thing that had been waiting for me all this time. The whispering began again, this time more familiar, like a memory trying to claw its way to the surface of my mind. But as much as I tried to hold onto my sanity, I could feel it slipping like sand through my fingers. And then, suddenly, a single image flashed in my mind. The photograph. The one I had found in the album. But this time, the photograph wasn't just an image. It was a doorway, a portal to a place that I couldn't quite understand. The figure in the photo, it wasn't a shadow anymore. It was real. It was standing before me, its hollow eyes staring right into mine. Its grin stretched wider, impossibly wide, until I could see nothing but the darkness inside it. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but it was too late. The figure reached forward, its cold, skeletal hand brushing my cheek once again. And this time, I didn't flinch. I couldn't. "You've always been here," it whispered, its voice now like 1,000 others, all of them speaking the same words over and over again. And I understood. The house. The photograph. The darkness. It wasn't just a place. It was a loop. A cycle. It wasn't trying to trap me. It had already trapped me. I was already a part of it. And as the figure's hand wrapped around my throat, I realized with a sickening clarity that this had been my fate all along. To become part of the photograph. To be absorbed by the house, just like those who had come before me. And now, there would be no escape. The last thing I heard before the darkness consumed me was the whisper of my own name, carried on the wind. "You've always been here." I woke up in a place that felt both strange and eerily familiar. The air was stale, and the silence hung so thick around me it pressed against my chest, making each breath feel heavier than the last. My eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light filtering through what seemed like a dusty window. The room, small and claustrophobic, was empty except for the peeling wallpaper and the faint smell of mildew that lingered in the air. There was no movement, no sound except for the slow, rhythmic beating of my heart. I sat up, the disorientation clouding my thoughts. My fingers brushed against my throat, feeling the tightness there, as if someone had just been there, touching me. I could still sense the presence of it, the coldness, the hollow gaze, the whispers that now seemed to linger in the corners of my mind, like a memory that wouldn't fade. I tried to stand, but my legs wobbled beneath me, unsteady as though I hadn't used them in years. The walls felt like they were closing in, and I instinctively reached out for something to hold on to, anything to ground me in reality. Then, my eyes caught sight of something on the floor, a photograph. It was an old, worn picture, edges frayed as though it had been handled 1,000 times. My breath caught in my throat as I picked it up, the weight of it both familiar and terrifying. It was the same photograph I had seen before, the one I had found in the album. But this time, something was different. The figure in the photo was no longer just a shadow. It was standing at the edge of the frame, its grin wider, its eyes gleaming with a sinister satisfaction. My own reflection, no, not mine, but a version of me, was there too, hidden within the dark recesses of the image. I hadn't noticed it before, but now I couldn't look away. The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just a photograph. It was a warning. A trap. And somehow, I had walked straight into it. I dropped the photo, my heart pounding in my chest as I backed away, but there was no place to run. The room had no door, no windows. Just walls that seemed to pulse with the same suffocating presence that had been haunting me. The whispers began again, a chorus of voices that melded into one, repeating the same words over and over. "You've always been here." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the voices, the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to every corner of this place. I tried to think, to remember how I had gotten here, but my mind felt clouded, as if someone, something, was erasing my memories, piece by piece. When I opened my eyes again, the photograph was gone. The room was silent now, the oppressive weight of the air gone, replaced by a cold emptiness. My fingers brushed against my neck again, and this time I felt the deep scratch marks there, like claws that had torn into my skin. It was as if the presence, it had marked me, claimed me. And then, as if in response to my fear, the door appeared. Slowly, quietly, as though it had always been there, hidden just out of sight. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, but before I could turn it, a sound came from behind me, soft, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. The shuffling of feet. The rustling of fabric. Someone, or something, was moving, getting closer. I spun around, my heart pounding. But there was nothing there. The silence was deafening. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, my mind racing. I needed to escape, to find my way out of this nightmare. But with every step I took, I felt the weight of it behind me, just out of sight, always following, always watching. The whispers were louder now, clearer. You've always been here. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stop. I turned corner after corner, the dim light growing colder, more distorted with each step. The building stretched on endlessly, an impossible labyrinth, as if the walls themselves were shifting and closing in around me. And then, just when I thought I couldn't run anymore, I reached the front door. The one that led outside. The one I had been searching for. I grabbed the handle, twisting it with desperation, only for it to remain locked. I slammed my shoulder into the door again and again, but it wouldn't budge. The whispering was now a maddening roar in my ears. The voice that had haunted me, that had followed me from the moment I saw the photograph, was everywhere now, suffocating me. You've always been here. I stopped, my hands falling limply at my sides. I couldn't escape. The reality of it settled on me like a cold weight in my chest. The place, the figure, the photograph, it wasn't just part of my past. It was part of my future too. And the worst part was that I couldn't even remember how I got here, or how long I had been trapped. I wasn't just lost. I was always meant to be here. And I knew, deep down, that I would never leave. Not truly. Because in this place, I was already a part of it. I always had been. Have you ever felt the chill of a place that's supposed to be safe? That unease in the pit of your stomach when something isn't quite right, but you can't put your finger on it? I felt it the moment I stepped into that hotel. It wasn't a grand place, just a small, old building on the edge of town. The kind of hotel you book for a short stay, expecting nothing more than a bed for the night. I had arrived late, tired from hours of driving, the kind of exhaustion that made the world blur at the edges. I was ready to collapse into the soft embrace of sleep, but something about the place made me uneasy from the start. The lobby was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of old wood and dust. The receptionist, a thin man with tired eyes, handed me a key without a word. The key had a single number on it, room 304. He didn't smile, didn't speak. There was something almost too quiet about him, but I shrugged it off. I thanked him and took the key. The hallway was just as unremarkable, the carpet worn and the walls faded. As I walked down the corridor, I couldn't help but feel a shiver crawl up my spine. My footsteps echoed strangely in the silence, as if the building were holding its breath. Room 304 was at the end of the hall. When I reached it, I slid the key into the lock, the familiar click of the door opening sounding almost too loud in the stillness. The room inside was small, with a single bed against one wall, a dresser, and a small desk. It wasn't anything special, just a standard room, but as I closed the door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That's when I noticed the note. It was folded neatly on the small table next to the bed. No envelope, just a simple, handwritten message. Do not leave the door open. I stared at the note for a moment, trying to make sense of it. It didn't seem like the kind of advice you'd find in a hotel room. Who would leave a note like that? And why? I shrugged it off, setting the note aside. Maybe it was just some odd precaution from the hotel management. But still, a strange unease settled over me, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was more than just a warning. I unpacked my things and decided to take a shower. The water was cold at first, but after a few moments, it warmed up. The sound of the water running, the steam rising in the small bathroom, should have been soothing. But instead, every sound seemed to be magnified, each drop of water falling, each creak of the building settling, each distant whisper of wind outside the window. I finished quickly and dried off, the feeling of being watched never quite leaving me. When I returned to the main room, I paused by the door, looking back at the note once more. It was still there, the words as clear as before. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the lingering feeling that something was wrong. I didn't want to dwell on it, so I grabbed the remote and turned on the TV, hoping to distract myself. Hours passed. The night stretched on, and the quiet seemed to grow thicker, as if the world outside had stopped moving altogether. But despite the silence, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I looked at the door. It was closed, as it should be. But then, just as I began to relax, I heard it. A soft sound, almost too quiet to hear. It was the faintest of creaks. A sound so subtle, I might have imagined it if it hadn't been followed by another. And then another. I turned my gaze to the door. My breath caught in my throat. The handle, it was moving. Slowly, as though something, or someone, on the other side was gently turning it. I jumped up, my heart pounding in my chest, but before I could reach the door, it creaked open by itself. Just a crack. Barely enough to see through. I stood frozen, staring at the sliver of darkness on the other side, my mind racing. The hallway outside was empty. There was no one there. But why had the door opened? And who, or what, had caused it? A chill ran down my spine as I slowly stepped forward. The silence of the hotel was unbearable now, pressing on me from all sides. I had to know. I took a deep breath and pushed the door shut, locking it behind me. The sensation of someone watching me, of something waiting, refused to leave. I returned to the bed, the unease in my chest growing with every passing moment. But then the most chilling part came. I could hear it again. Faint, almost imperceptible at first, but growing clearer with every passing second. The sound of someone breathing. Low, steady, too close. I turned to look at the door once more, and to my horror, the crack had widened. Just enough for me to see the hallway beyond. Empty. Silent. And then, in the distance, I heard something. A shuffle of feet. A voice, low and rasping, that whispered, "Don't leave the door open." My heart hammered in my chest as I stared at the door, my breath shallow and erratic. The voice, faint but unmistakable, sent a jolt of terror through me. I couldn't tell where it had come from, but it felt too close. The seconds stretched into minutes as I stood frozen, my eyes fixed on the door. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to get out of that room, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the widening crack. The sound of shuffling footsteps echoed down the hall, closer, closer. A part of me wanted to open the door to see if anyone was there. But another, more primal part of me knew better. The note. The warning. Don't leave the door open. The room around me seemed to close in, the walls pressing tighter as my anxiety grew. The air felt colder, sharper, like I was suffocating in it. My hands trembled as I reached for the lamp on the nightstand, turning it on for some semblance of light, as if it could ward off whatever was lurking just beyond the door. I took a step back, my foot brushing against the bed. I glanced at the clock. It was just after midnight. How long had I been here? How long had I been waiting? The noise outside the door stopped. For a moment, there was only the heavy silence that filled the room, broken only by the rapid beating of my heart in my ears. I strained to listen, but the footsteps had ceased. The oppressive quiet seemed even more intense now, and my mind raced, conjuring the worst possibilities. I thought about the note again. The message, so simple, so direct. Don't leave the door open. What was the real threat? Was it someone trying to break in? Or was it something else? Something far worse? My instincts screamed at me to leave, but there was nowhere to go. The hotel was small, and this room was tucked away at the end of the hallway. I'd have to pass the door. If something was out there, if it was waiting for me, I didn't have the courage to face it. The door handle rattled again. No, I thought, my breath catching in my throat. I scrambled back, clutching the edge of the bed. It was happening again. The door was moving by itself, as if some invisible hand was twisting the knob. The soft creak of the hinges, the shift of the door against its frame. It was happening too easily, as if it was meant to be like this. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here, paralyzed by fear. I grabbed the phone from the nightstand and dialed the front desk, my fingers trembling as I punched in the number. It rang and rang. No answer. A rising panic gripped me. The hotel staff had been silent all evening. The receptionist had barely spoken. It had been almost like no one cared about the people staying here. No one to help. No one to hear me. I dropped the phone back onto the table with a clatter. The room felt suffocating now, the air thick with dread. I could hear nothing except the faint hum of the ventilation system and the ever-growing sound of my own heartbeat. The door creaked again. This time, I didn't wait. I rushed to the door, my mind screaming at me to lock it again, to make sure it was sealed. But as I reached for the handle, I froze. The door, it was already locked. I could see the small bolt, the one that slid into place from the inside, still secured. There was no way it could have opened on its own, no way it could have shifted without someone or something on the other side. I stared at it for a moment, my heart sinking as a cold realization settled over me. Whatever was out there had done this. It hadn't just been an accident. The door had opened on its own, by force, and I hadn't even noticed it happening. I turned back to the room, my eyes wild now, darting over every corner. I could almost feel the weight of the place pressing in on me, like the walls were leaning closer with each passing second. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here another minute. I rushed to the window, hoping it would open and give me some escape. but when I tried to lift the sash, it wouldn't budge. It was stuck, sealed shut. I tugged harder, but it didn't give. That's when I heard it, the low, guttural whisper from behind me. "Don't leave the door open." I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was clearer now, almost real, coming from just a few feet away. It wasn't the wind or the creaking of the building. It was someone or something close. There was a figure in the corner of the room. At first, I couldn't make it out, just a shadow, a vague shape against the dim light. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw it more clearly. A man. No, not a man. The figure was too still, too unnatural. His face was obscured, as if covered in darkness, his form outlined in a way that made it impossible to focus on him. I stepped back slowly, my legs trembling. My mind screamed at me to run, to do anything to get away, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The figure didn't move, just stood there, its form blending with the shadows of the room. "Don't leave the door open," it whispered again, its voice like a rasping breath. I froze. Suddenly, I understood. The warning. The note. The door. This wasn't just a strange occurrence. It was a pattern. Something had been trying to tell me what was coming. And now, it was here. The figure in the corner remained motionless, its presence suffocating. The whisper continued to echo in my mind, a constant loop I couldn't escape. "Don't leave the door open." I wanted to scream, to shout, to make any noise that could shatter the stillness, but I couldn't move. My legs were locked in place, as if the very air had become too thick to breathe, too heavy to break through. The figure stood there, impossibly still, and yet it felt like its presence was growing, spreading across the room. My mind raced. Was this a dream? A hallucination? No, this was real. I could feel it, could hear it. The soft creak of the floorboards under my feet. The faintest shift in the air, as though something was closing in. I was being watched. A cold sweat beaded on my forehead as I glanced at the door. The warning. The note. Was it too late? Should I have locked it tighter? Should I have never opened it at all? My fingers twitched with the urge to check the bolt again, but I dared not look away from the figure. What if it moved? Then, as if the air around me had thickened into something solid, the figure took a slow step forward. My heart lurched in my chest. The floor creaked beneath its feet, the sound sending a shock of ice through my veins. I stumbled back, desperate for distance, my mind whirling. What is it? I thought. What do you want? But there was no answer. Only silence. And then the door creaked again. I didn't have to look. I could hear the movement clearly now, slow, deliberate, as if something were pushing against it from the other side. I could hear the wood groaning under the pressure. The lock rattled. No, not again. I hadn't even realized I was holding my breath until my chest constricted painfully. I turned back toward the corner, where the figure still stood, unmoving. Its shape was now more defined, though it remained shrouded in darkness. But I could feel its eyes on me, pressing, cold, unblinking. My body froze in place as I realized I was trapped. The door. The figure. The whispering. The thing outside the door, was it trying to get in? A sharp crack sounded from the other side of the room. I jerked, my heart leaping into my throat. The window. The window I tried to open earlier, it was cracking. A long, jagged line formed across the glass, as if something were pushing against it from the outside. I ran toward the window. I had to get out. There was no other choice. The figure, whatever it was waiting for me, and if I didn't act now, I would never escape. My fingers fumbled with the lock, but the glass held firm. I tried again, my heart hammering in my chest. The glass was becoming more fragile with each breath, threatening to shatter any moment. I slammed my palms against it, desperate, but it didn't give. And then I heard it, the voice, low and drawn out, coming from just behind me. "Don't leave the door open." I spun around. The figure was closer now, its presence unbearable. It was standing right at the edge of the bed, its face still obscured in shadow, but I could feel it watching me, assessing me. "It's too late now," the figure whispered, its voice like a low growl. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing inward. My breath came faster, my body shuddering with terror. I wanted to run, but the figure's presence paralyzed me. My limbs refused to obey. I couldn't fight it. I looked at the door again. The handle was turning. It was opening. But there was no time. The moment the door creaked fully open, I felt the temperature drop. The air became thick, as if something was sucking all the warmth from the room. I was no longer alone. The presence outside the door was real. It was here. I could hear the faint sound of shuffling footsteps, like something dragging itself across the floor. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, every instinct telling me to run, to hide, to do anything. But I stood there, trapped. The figure spoke again, its voice almost gentle now. "You were warned." And with that, the door swung wide open. The room seemed to bend, the air warping as the presence filled the doorway. It was no longer a figure. It was something darker, something far worse. Its form twisted and shifted like smoke, but there was a solidness to it that defied explanation. It wasn't a ghost, it wasn't a man, it was something beyond that, something that shouldn't exist. I felt the cold seeping into my skin, chilling me to the bone. My breath came out in visible puffs, and yet I couldn't tear my eyes away from the doorway. The thing in the doorway tilted its head, its dark shape pulsing with an unnatural energy. It was waiting for me to make a move, to run. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed, trapped in my own fear, as if the very act of moving would seal my fate. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure reached out a hand toward me. I screamed. It was too late. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the door slowly closing, with the whisper still echoing in my ears. "Don't leave the door open." I awoke with a jolt, my body frozen in place. My chest heaved, breath ragged as though I had just run miles. My eyes shot open, and I found myself back in the hotel room, disoriented. The pale light of early morning filtered through the window, casting a soft glow over everything. I blinked. The room. The bed. It was all exactly as it had been before, yet something felt terribly off. The same oppressive silence hung in the air, but there was no sign of the figure or the door that had opened to it. I rubbed my eyes, trying to calm my breathing. It had to have been a nightmare. A horrifying dream born of fear and paranoia. But as I sat up and glanced around the room, I felt an unsettling sensation crawl up my spine. I reached for the bedside table where I'd left the note. But when my fingers brushed the surface, I froze. The note was gone. My heart thudded in my chest. The memory of it was fresh in my mind, the warning scrawled in hurried handwriting, "Don't leave the door open." I had placed it there, next to the lamp, but now it was gone, as though it had never existed. I stood up quickly, my mind racing. The door was closed. Tight. I rushed over to it, my fingers trembling as I gripped the handle. For a brief moment, I stood there, unsure of what to do. The silence in the room was unbearable. And yet, there was no sound from the hallway, no indication of anything unusual outside. Taking a deep breath, I twisted the handle, my pulse quickening. The door opened. Slowly. Nothing. There was no figure waiting for me on the other side, no twisted shadow creeping into the room. The hallway beyond looked as it should, empty, dimly lit by the soft, overhead lights. I stepped out of the room, my feet shuffling against the worn carpet. The hotel seemed strangely quiet this morning. No sounds of voices, no bustling staff or guests moving about. It felt empty. Empty in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I walked down the hallway, pausing to glance at each door I passed. They were all closed. The hotel seemed abandoned, the atmosphere eerily still. A faint chill lingered in the air, an unshakable sense of discomfort clinging to me. Then I heard it. A sound, soft at first, like a whisper. It was coming from the direction of my room. I stopped in my tracks. This sound, it was like the faint creaking of floorboards. I turned around, my eyes fixed on the hallway behind me. The hallway was empty, yet the sound persisted. The air thickened. I felt a presence, something I couldn't see, but I knew was there. I was no longer alone. I rushed back to my room, my feet moving faster now, my body trembling. I reached the door, only to find it slightly ajar, just enough for a sliver of darkness to seep through. I closed it, I thought desperately, my mind screaming. I locked it. But the door had been left open. I pushed it open, heart hammering in my chest. The room was exactly the same, but the atmosphere had shifted. The oppressive weight of the night before seemed to have returned. The faint smell of something metallic lingered in the air, and the walls, once comforting, now seemed to press in on me. I stepped inside, but my feet faltered. There, on the bedside table, was something new, a single, small envelope. My hand shook as I reached for it, my fingers brushing the cool paper. It was addressed to me, written in the same hurried, uneven handwriting. You shouldn't have opened the door. I pulled my hand back, my breath catching in my throat. The words echoed in my mind, growing louder. You shouldn't have opened the door. The words were so familiar, so chilling. I turned toward the window, my eyes scanning the room as though expecting to see the figure again or some other sinister presence. But nothing. And yet, the door, now fully open behind me, reminded me of that warning. The advice from the note, from the voice. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't deny it. Something was wrong. So wrong. And I had to get out. I grabbed my bag and shoved the envelope into it, desperate to leave. I wasn't sure where I would go, or how I would even escape this hotel. But I couldn't stay here, not when I felt as if I were being watched, followed. I stepped toward the door. And then, there it was again, the whisper. Don't leave the door open. I froze. It was louder this time, a voice unmistakably coming from behind me, from the shadows that had gathered in the corner of the room. I spun around, eyes wild. The room was empty. But the whisper had come from somewhere close. Too close. I slammed the door shut, locking it as tightly as I could. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps. The room seemed to darken around me, as if the walls were closing in. I couldn't leave. Not now. Not until I understood what was happening. But the sense of being followed was inescapable. The note, the door, the warnings, and that whisper. It would never stop. Never. But the most chilling thought crept into my mind. What if I wasn't meant to leave at all? I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. And then the lights flickered, casting long shadows across the room. The whisper grew louder. You shouldn't have opened the door. The door. Always the door. But now it was too late. The whisper continued, a haunting presence that refused to leave. It echoed in my ears, reverberating in the corners of my mind, as though it were trapped in the very walls of the room. You shouldn't have opened the door. The words played on a loop, louder each time, seeping into my thoughts like poison. I stumbled backward, my hand clinging to the doorframe for support. My head spun, my thoughts fractured. What was real anymore? Was I losing my mind, or was this some kind of cruel game that I was trapped in? The air in the room grew colder, almost unbearable, and the shadows on the walls stretched longer, twisting into grotesque shapes. I glanced at the small envelope on the table, the one that had appeared out of nowhere. The words written on it were etched into my brain, as if I could never escape them. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe deeply, to center myself. Stay calm. I had to get out. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here any longer, not with this heavy sense of dread suffocating me. I turned toward the window, desperate for some escape, but the glass was too high to climb through. The room felt like a prison, a place from which I would never emerge. The whispering stopped suddenly, leaving me in a chilling silence that felt worse than the sound. But something had changed. Something was different. I looked back at the door. It was still shut, but it wasn't locked anymore. I could feel the cold draft coming from the crack beneath it, as though the room itself was exhaling a deep, exhausted breath. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what was on the other side, but I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to find an answer. Gripping the handle, I hesitated. The sensation of being watched hit me again. It was as if I were standing on the edge of something, a precipice, and I was about to fall into an unknown abyss. But the door had to open. I had to see what was beyond it. I twisted the handle and pushed the door open. The hallway was empty, just as it had been before. But there was something different about the air. It was thick, heavy with tension, and the silence was oppressive. No sound. No footsteps. No voices. Just an overwhelming stillness that made my skin crawl. I stepped out into the hallway, the soft carpet beneath my feet muffling my movements. My legs felt shaky, unsteady, as though I were walking through a dream or a nightmare. I didn't know where to go. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. The note, the whisper, the strange feeling of being followed, it all felt like a puzzle I couldn't solve, a story I didn't understand. I glanced to the left and then to the right. The hallway stretched endlessly, each door just as indistinguishable as the last. But something caught my attention, something out of place. At the end of the hallway, far down where the light faded into darkness, there was a door that stood ajar. It was the only door that wasn't fully closed, the only one that seemed to beckon me. The door. It was always the door. I couldn't stop myself. Some force I couldn't explain was pulling me toward it. I walked down the hallway, my feet dragging, each step heavier than the last. As I neared the door, I could feel the cold air rushing from the gap, as though it were inviting me in, calling me to uncover the truth. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I pushed it open. The room inside was shrouded in darkness, but I could make out the faintest silhouette at the far end. A figure, standing motionless. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It was too dark to see clearly, but I knew I wasn't alone. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It was just there, watching me. "Hello?" My voice trembled as I called out, but it was swallowed by the thick silence that filled the room. The figure didn't answer. I took a tentative step forward, my breath shallow, my body tensing. The room felt colder, the air heavier with each step I took. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, panic flooding my veins, but the room remained dark. The air was suffocating. The figure had moved. I couldn't see it anymore, but I felt it. It was right behind me, breathing down my neck, its presence so close I could almost feel its hand on my shoulder. "You shouldn't have opened the door," the whisper came again, but it wasn't from the shadows, it was right behind me. I turned, my eyes wide with terror. There was nothing there. No figure. No presence. Just the silence. And then, slowly, the lights flickered on. The room was completely different from the one I had stepped into. It was familiar, yet foreign. It was my room. My hotel room. The same bed. The same furniture. The same walls. I was back. But I wasn't sure how. I looked around, disoriented, as if I were seeing everything for the first time. The whispers had stopped, but I could still feel the weight of them pressing against my mind. I had to get out. I had to leave. I ran to the door and threw it open. The hallway outside was empty. Silent. But the note was gone. There was nothing left. No trace of what had happened. Only the overwhelming feeling that I was still trapped. That I would never escape. And then I saw it written on the wall just outside my room. "Don't leave the door open." I slammed the door shut and locked it. But I knew the whispers would return. They would never stop. I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint at first, like a distant murmur coming from the other side of the wall. I froze, listening intently. The apartment next to mine had been empty for months. The landlord had told me the tenants moved out suddenly, leaving everything behind. I hadn't heard anything from that apartment since then. The silence had been unsettling, but that night it was broken. I turned over in bed, straining my ears. The voices grew louder. It wasn't clear what they were saying, but it was unmistakably human. 2 or 3 people, maybe more. The sound was soft but persistent, like they were arguing quietly, almost as if they were trying not to disturb anyone. I glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight, and I knew the neighbors hadn't moved back in. I hadn't seen any moving trucks, and the lights in the hallway outside were still off. The voices continued for what felt like hours. A part of me wanted to get up and knock on the door, but another part of me hesitated, uneasy about disturbing them. What if I was wrong? What if I imagined it all? But it was real. I could hear it. There was no way I was dreaming. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy, like the air was pressing against me. I sat up in bed, wide awake, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe I misheard. Maybe it was something outside. But I knew that wasn't true. The sounds had come from next door. There was no mistaking it. I lay back down, closing my eyes, but sleep didn't come. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind kept racing with questions. What had I just heard? Who was in that apartment? And why hadn't I noticed them moving in? Something didn't feel right. Just as I was about to drift off, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Slow, deliberate steps, one after the other. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My first instinct was to get up and check, but then I stopped myself. What if it wasn't just the neighbors? What if something else was going on? The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I could feel the weight of the silence press against my skin, and I held my breath. I waited, my mind racing. But then, just as quickly as they had come, the steps receded, fading down the hall. I sat there in the dark, listening to the distant hum of the building, unsure of what to do next. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The sun was shining through the windows, and the usual sounds of the city filled the air. But something was off. As I left my apartment, I saw families standing in the hallway near the door to the vacant apartment. A man, a woman, and a child stood there, smiling at me as if they had been there for years. They looked familiar, but I couldn't place where I'd seen them before. "Good morning," the man said with a warm smile. "We just moved in." I froze. I had seen this family before. But how? And when? I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. Something was wrong. I had just heard them last night, but they were telling me they had just moved in. It didn't make sense. "Nice to meet you," the woman added, her voice sweet but oddly mechanical. I forced a smile, nodding as I quickly walked past them. My mind was racing. I couldn't stop thinking about the voices, the footsteps, and the strange family standing in the hallway. Something had changed. The space around me felt different, distorted, as if the world itself had shifted without me noticing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The apartment next door was supposed to be empty, but now, there was a family living there. And I was left with a gnawing uncertainty about everything I had heard, everything I had felt. Something wasn't adding up, and I was terrified of what I might uncover if I kept digging. But I knew one thing for sure: there was more to this than I could possibly understand. And the answers might be more frightening than I could imagine. The next few days felt like a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the family. Every time I passed their door, I could feel my pulse quicken. The man, the woman, and the child, they were always there, always smiling in that strange way, as though they had been living there for years. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew something was off. Their apartment, once bare and abandoned, was now filled with the sound of voices, laughter, talking, the sound of furniture being moved. It was as if they had been living there forever, even though I had only seen them the day before. The echoes of their voices in the hallway seemed to grow louder and louder each time I heard them, filling the space around me until the apartment felt suffocating. It wasn't just the sounds. The hallway itself had changed. I could feel it in the air. The atmosphere had shifted. The familiar smells of the building, the faint scent of old wood and cleaning supplies, were now mingled with something else. Something metallic, almost like the scent of iron or rust. It was subtle at first, like a faint aftertaste, but it grew stronger every day. I began to notice other small details. The lights in the hallway flickered more often now, casting shadows that seemed to move with a mind of their own. One moment, the hallway would be empty and bathed in the sterile white light from the overhead bulbs. The next, it would be swallowed by a deep, unsettling shadow, as though something was lurking just out of sight. One evening, as I was walking down the hall to check my mailbox, I noticed something strange. The door to the apartment next door was slightly ajar. It wasn't fully open, just enough for me to see a sliver of the dark interior beyond. But what caught my attention wasn't the door, it was the sound. The unmistakable sound of someone whispering, only this time it was different. It wasn't the same voices from before. These were lower, more guttural, as if they were coming from the depths of the apartment itself. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle as I tried to make sense of the noise. The whispers seemed to call out to me, growing clearer with each passing second. The longer I stood there, the more the voices seemed to blend together, until I couldn't tell if they were words or just incoherent murmurs. Then, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A sharp, scraping noise, like something heavy dragging across the floor. It was so loud, so intrusive, that it made my body jerk in surprise. My heart raced in my chest as I quickly pulled my hand away from the door, backing away from the apartment. I turned around to leave, but before I could move more than a few steps, the door behind me creaked open fully. I spun around in alarm, but there was nothing there. The hallway stood empty, just as it always had. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone in the building. Not anymore. The next morning, I woke to the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside my door. Slow, deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth. I pressed my ear to the door, heart pounding, but there was no one there. The hall was empty. I stepped out into the corridor, my eyes darting to the door next door. The family was gone. Their door was shut tight, but the strange feeling remained. The lights in the hallway flickered again, this time with a violent intensity that made me feel like I was caught in some sort of dream. I couldn't understand what was happening. The apartment next door was supposed to be empty, but it wasn't. The family was gone, and yet they hadn't really left. The feeling of their presence lingered, like an invisible force pressing against the walls. I went to the landlord's office later that day, hoping for some answers. Maybe I could ask about the family, about the apartment. But when I mentioned it, the landlord seemed confused. "That apartment has been vacant for months," he said, glancing at me with a raised brow. "No one has moved in there. Are you sure you're not mistaken?" I could feel a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. There was no mistaking it. I had seen them. I had heard them. But the landlord's words didn't match the reality I had experienced. As I left his office, the unease in my chest only deepened. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure: I had to stay away from that apartment. Something was wrong with it. Something was wrong with the entire building. And as I walked back to my apartment, I realized something else. The family wasn't the only thing that had changed. The building itself had become something else. Something that I didn't recognize anymore. It had only been a few days since the landlord had denied the existence of the family, but everything around me had changed. The hallway, the apartment next door, the very air in the building, it all felt wrong. The feeling of being watched, of something just out of sight, had only grown stronger. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers from next door had returned, but this time they were accompanied by strange sounds, the scratching of nails on wood, soft thuds like something being dropped, and a constant low hum that I couldn't place. I tried to ignore it, but the noises seemed to seep through the walls, curling around my mind, making it impossible to think clearly. I got up, my legs shaky as I crossed the room. The floor creaked beneath my feet, but the noise was drowned out by the constant hum that seemed to fill the air. I stood by the window, staring out into the darkened city, trying to ground myself. The light from the street lamps barely penetrated the gloom outside, but it was enough to see the shadows moving along the walls of the hallway through the cracks in the door. The hallway looked different now. It was longer than I remembered, stretching out further than it should have. The walls seemed to bend slightly, as though the space was warping around me, pulling and shifting. My heart raced as I backed away from the door, unsure of what I was seeing. The space had changed. The walls felt closer, but the hallway itself seemed to stretch endlessly. I couldn't stay in my apartment. I needed to know what was happening next door, to see if there was anything left of the family or if it was all in my head. I grabbed my coat and walked into the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. The door to the apartment next door was wide open, but there was no sign of the family. There was only darkness inside. I hesitated, then stepped forward. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound sharp in the otherwise silent corridor. Inside, the apartment was completely empty. The furniture I had heard being moved in the days before was gone, leaving behind only bare walls and cold, unwelcoming space. But as I walked further in, something caught my eye. On the floor, near the center of the room, there was a faint outline, like a shadow, only lighter, like the shape of a person, as if someone had been standing there for a long time and then left. I knelt down, my breath catching in my throat. The outline on the floor was still there, but it was wrong. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a depression in the wood, like the space had been pressed down, as if something had been sitting there, waiting. The whispers started again, louder this time, surrounding me from all directions. I stood up quickly, heart racing. The air grew cold, much colder than it had been a moment ago. My breath formed a mist in front of me, and I could feel my skin tightening with fear. I spun around, my eyes scanning the room. The door to the hallway had closed behind me, locking me in. The walls seemed to close in two, the space around me shrinking. I ran to the door, but when I tried to turn the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door was solid, immovable, as if it had been fused into place. The sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the apartment, slow and deliberate. I turned toward the noise, my chest tight with panic. The sound grew louder, closer, until I could hear the soft scrape of shoes against the floor. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is anyone there?" No answer. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing at the far end of the apartment. It was tall, blurry, like a silhouette, but it was wrong. The shape wavered, shifting in the dim light. It had no distinct features, just a dark outline that seemed to absorb the light around it. I froze, unable to move. The figure started to approach me, its movements slow but purposeful. Each step it took sent a chill through my body, and the air around me seemed to grow thicker, heavier. I reached for the door handle again, desperation taking over. But this time, as my hand touched the metal, it turned. The door opened, and I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. The apartment door slammed shut behind me, and for a moment, everything was still. The hallway seemed to return to its usual state, the lights flickering overhead as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something had changed. Something had followed me out of that apartment. I rushed back to my own door, but as I reached for the handle, I stopped. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I turned slowly, scanning the hallway. There, at the end of the corridor, the same figure from the apartment stood. It was watching me. I slammed the door behind me, locking it tightly. My hands were trembling, and my head felt foggy. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was exhausted, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was in this building. Something that shouldn't be. I couldn't escape it. Not anymore. The night dragged on, each minute stretching into eternity. My pulse hammered in my ears as I sat against the door, my back pressed to the cold wood, staring at the shadowy outline of my apartment. I tried to convince myself that I was just tired, that everything I'd seen and felt was some trick of the mind, but the fear in my chest refused to subside. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching, waiting. The sounds in the hallway had stopped for now, but the silence felt suffocating. It was as if the entire building held its breath, anticipating what would come next. Every creak of the floor, every flicker of light in the dim hallway outside, made my heart skip a beat. I stood up, trembling, and moved cautiously toward the window. I wanted to see the outside world, to ground myself in the normalcy of the city below, but the glass offered little comfort. The streets were eerily quiet, the cityscape lit only by the flickering glow of streetlights. It felt distant, disconnected. My gaze drifted back to the hallway. The door to the vacant apartment was still closed. But I couldn't shake the image of the figure standing there, watching me. I knew it was real. It had to be. And yet, when I thought about it, the more it felt like a part of the building itself, like a distortion in the space, something that didn't belong but had come to stay. I tried to distract myself, but the whispers returned, louder this time. They came from every direction, filling the space around me with soft, unintelligible murmurs. It was as though the apartment itself was alive with sound, the walls vibrating with the voices of people I couldn't see. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. The voices seemed to seep into my very bones, a cold whisper against my skin. Then, the footsteps started again. They were different this time. They were not slow, deliberate steps like before, but frantic, hurried, as though someone, or something, was running toward me. I could hear them coming down the hall, echoing, bouncing off the walls. My breath caught in my throat as I looked at the door, terrified to open it, terrified of what I might find. The doorknob began to rattle. I backed away, heart pounding, my mind racing. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was nothing but the deafening silence. But it didn't last. The door rattled again, more violently this time, as though someone was trying to force it open from the other side. I ran to the back of the room, my eyes wide with fear. I needed to escape. But the apartment was small, and there was nowhere to hide. There was no way out. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the temperature dropped. A cold draft swept through the room, chilling me to the bone. The whispers became louder, clearer, until I could hear individual words, although they made no sense. They were coming from all around me, swirling through the air like a storm. Then, the door crashed open. I stood frozen, unable to move as the figure from before appeared in the doorway. It was taller than I remembered, the shadow stretching out like a dark veil, its features still indistinguishable. It stepped into the room, and the floor creaked under its weight. I could feel the air grow heavier, as though the very space itself was being pulled toward it. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The presence in the room was overwhelming, suffocating. I could feel it pressing in on me, its unseen eyes watching, studying me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed, trapped in the grip of whatever this thing was. My mind was spinning, torn between the overwhelming urge to flee and the terrifying certainty that there was nowhere to go. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in around me, and the figure grew larger, its form becoming more defined. "Leave," it whispered, the sound like 1,000 voices all merging into one. The word echoed in my mind, not spoken aloud, but felt deep within my chest. I could feel it, that urge to obey, to run, but my body remained rooted in place. The figure took another step closer, and the air became thick with its presence. My breath caught in my throat as the shadows around it began to stretch, elongating like dark tendrils, reaching out toward me. "Leave," the voice repeated, stronger now, like a command. I wanted to obey, but I couldn't. Something in me refused to give in. The room was no longer my own. It was being swallowed by this thing, this presence that didn't belong. I looked around desperately for any way out, but the space was no longer familiar. The walls seemed to bend and twist, and the door to the hallway had disappeared. The figure was now so close, its shadow wrapping around me like a cold, suffocating blanket. It leaned in, its form growing more solid with each passing second. Its voice, now unmistakably clear, filled my mind. "Stay." I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. My body moved of its own accord, a force pulling me toward the center of the room, as though the very air was alive with some unknown force. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure's face, or what could have been a face, a distorted, shifting mask of darkness that grinned at me, empty and endless. I woke up with a jolt, gasping for air as if I had been underwater. The first thing I noticed was the overwhelming silence. No whispers. No footsteps. No presence in the room. For a fleeting moment, I thought it had all been a terrible nightmare, the darkness, the figure, the whispers. But then I looked around and realized something had changed. The apartment was not the same. The walls seemed to have stretched, the corners too far away, as though the space had been expanded in some unnatural way. The light from the window, which should have been dull and gray, now poured in with an intensity that felt wrong, too bright, too stark. The air was thick with an unnatural chill. I tried to stand, but my legs felt weak, as though they had been numbed. The floor beneath me felt cold and foreign, every step I took echoing in the empty, distorted space. My body was still trembling, but it wasn't just from fear. It was as though something had fundamentally shifted inside me, like the very foundation of reality had cracked open. I stumbled toward the door, desperate to leave, but when I reached for the handle, I stopped. The door was no longer the same. It looked like the one I had entered through, but it felt different, somehow wrong. The wood was smooth, too smooth, as though it had been polished to a gleaming shine. The handle didn't fit in my hand anymore. It felt like it belonged to someone else. I pulled my hand away and backed up. The hallway outside the apartment was gone. There was no hallway, no stairwell, no exit. Only an endless stretch of white space, like a void that had swallowed the building whole. The air felt heavier now, suffocating, pressing down on me from all sides. And then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible hum. At first, I thought it was in my head, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from somewhere deep within the space, somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the door. The hum vibrated through my chest, resonating in the very core of my being. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The noise was like a physical force, pulling me toward it, tugging at my mind. I had to find the source. I had to see what was making the noise. But no matter where I looked, the space around me remained the same. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, they stretched endlessly in every direction, offering no sign of life, no escape. I walked forward, the hum growing louder with each step. The air was thick now, like I was moving through water, my body sluggish, my movements stiff. My eyes darted around the space, scanning for any sign of familiarity, but everything felt wrong. There were no windows, no doors, just an endless stretch of nothing. Then, a figure appeared. It wasn't the same one as before. This one was different. It was tall, like the other, but its body was more defined, more solid. It stood still in the distance, its outline blurred, as though it were made of smoke or mist. But it was there, watching me. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unrelenting. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was the same presence I had encountered before, the one that had followed me, the one that had stayed. I tried to step back, but my body wouldn't respond. I was rooted to the spot, my legs unable to move, my mind screaming at me to run, but my feet remained glued to the floor. The figure slowly began to move toward me, its form flickering, warping like smoke in the wind. And then I heard its voice again. It was not a whisper this time, not a murmur. It was loud, clear, and unmistakable. The words reverberated in my skull, sending a jolt of terror through me. Stay. The room seemed to shift around me, the walls bending, stretching, as though the space itself was warping in response to the figure's words. I could feel the air grow even heavier, pressing in on me, suffocating me. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my very bones. The figure stopped just a few feet away from me. Its face, or what could have been a face, was a blur, an empty void of darkness. There were no features, no eyes, no mouth. Just a hollow, shifting space that seemed to consume everything around it. I wanted to scream, to fight, to break free from whatever hold it had on me, but I couldn't. I could feel the presence wrapping around my mind, seeping into my thoughts, pulling me deeper into the void. There was nothing I could do. Nothing. The figure reached out a hand, and as it did, the space around us began to collapse. The walls twisted, the air churned, and I was no longer sure what was real. The figure's hand came closer, closer still, until it was just inches from my face. And then everything stopped. The room, the figure, the hum, all of it disappeared in an instant. I was left standing in the middle of an empty, silent space. My body was still frozen, my mind reeling from the sudden change. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered in the air, like a shadow that would never leave. I didn't know where I was anymore. I didn't know if I was still in the apartment or if I had crossed into something else entirely. All I knew was that I could never leave. Not now. Not after everything I had seen. And so I stood there, lost in the endless void, waiting for whatever would come next. Have you ever questioned something so simple, so ordinary, that it begins to feel like a puzzle, and with each new piece you try to fit in, the whole picture changes? I had one of those moments this morning. It started with something as mundane as a name. My name. It was just another typical day at work. The hum of fluorescent lights above, the soft tapping of keyboards, and the occasional murmur of my colleagues filled the space around me. I was sitting at my desk, sifting through some documents, when something caught my eye. It was my name on a report, but it was different. I stopped and squinted at it, staring at the paper as though I were seeing it for the first time. The name that was written wasn't mine. At first, I thought it was a typo. Maybe someone had mistakenly written the wrong name, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. I flipped through the pages of the document, expecting to find my correct name somewhere else, but to my confusion, it was everywhere, not just on the cover page, but scattered throughout the text, in places where my name should have been. I froze. It wasn't just a mistake. It was deliberate. The name on the paper was completely different, and I had no idea who it belonged to. I glanced around the office, my heart beginning to race. The sounds of typing and conversation continued, indifferent to the turmoil building inside me. I took a deep breath and decided to ask my coworker, Emily, sitting nearby. She was the closest person to me at work and the one I felt most comfortable with. "Hey, Emily," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Could you take a look at this for me? There seems to be a mix-up with my name on these documents." Emily turned her head, offering a distracted smile, but when her eyes landed on the report, her expression shifted to confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked, peering closely at the page. I pointed at the name. "It's not mine," I explained. "I mean, this isn't how my name is spelled." She leaned in closer, her brow furrowing as she read it. "That's your name, though. It's always been like that." I blinked, taken aback. "What?" "No, it's not. I've been working here for months, and I've never been called that. I've always been." Emily cut me off, her voice growing firmer. "No, that's your name. You've always been, name on the paper." I looked at her, my chest tightening with a mix of disbelief and growing anxiety. She couldn't be serious. Could she? I shook my head, suddenly feeling dizzy. I couldn't understand it. Why was she saying this? Why didn't she remember my real name? The name I had lived with for as long as I could remember? I looked around the office again, my gaze darting to each face. Everyone seemed normal, going about their work, unaware of the growing storm in my mind. No one was reacting to my confusion, and yet it felt like I had just stepped into a world where nothing made sense. I asked a few more people. I felt desperate now, my hands clammy as I approached one coworker after another, showing them the paper, asking if they had noticed the mistake. But everyone gave me the same response. "That's your name," they said, or "You've always been, new name." It wasn't just a fluke. It wasn't just one mistake or a typo. It was as though my entire identity had been rewritten, and everyone around me, everyone I worked with every day, was convinced it had always been that way. I tried to calm myself, to rationalize it. Maybe I had just missed something. Maybe my memory was playing tricks on me. But deep down, something told me that wasn't it. Something felt wrong. I could feel the unsettling weight of doubt creeping into my mind, and the more I thought about it, the harder it became to shake the feeling that something had changed, that I had changed. I spent the rest of the morning in a daze. I couldn't focus on my work, couldn't concentrate on the reports in front of me. Every time I looked at the documents, every time I glanced at the people around me, I felt like a stranger in my own life. I wasn't sure where I was anymore. I wasn't sure who I was anymore. By lunchtime, the confusion had turned to unease. I walked to the cafeteria with Emily, trying to keep up the appearance of normalcy, but my thoughts were spinning. I barely registered the small talk as we sat down, the chatter of colleagues around us blending into an indistinct murmur. My mind was elsewhere, running in circles, trying to make sense of everything. And then, just as I was about to ask Emily for more clarity, the strangest thing happened. One of my coworkers, Sarah, leaned over and smiled at me warmly. "It's so nice to see you, new name. How was your weekend?" Her words were like a jolt of ice water to my spine. My heart skipped a beat as she addressed me with a name I didn't recognize, the name that now seemed to have replaced mine in everyone's mind. Yeah, it was good," I mumbled, my voice strained. I tried to smile, but the tension in my chest made it almost impossible. Sarah didn't seem to notice my discomfort. She continued chatting, unaware of the storm that was quietly brewing inside me. But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. Something was wrong. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I kept glancing at the clock, counting down the minutes until I could leave the office. The walls around me seemed to close in tighter with each passing hour. The air felt thick, heavy, like I was trapped in a place where I didn't belong. It wasn't just the name anymore. It was the feeling of alienation, of something being off-kilter. My coworkers, the ones I'd worked alongside for months, continued to treat me as if nothing had changed. They greeted me with the same smiles, the same casual conversations, but their words felt hollow, like a broken record. When I returned to my desk after lunch, I found more documents waiting for me. But this time, I was prepared. I knew what I would find when I opened them. I didn't even need to look at the top of the page to know that my name, or the name that had replaced it, was printed there. I took a deep breath and tried to push the panic rising in my chest down. I could feel it tightening around my throat, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, to tear the papers apart, but instead, I took a steadying breath and forced myself to open the files. And there it was again. My name, or the name that wasn't mine, was everywhere. It was on every piece of paper in front of me. The signature at the bottom of each form was the same. The same strange, foreign name. I couldn't take it anymore. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone, my thumb hovering over the contact for HR. I needed answers. I needed to know why this was happening, why no one seemed to remember that my name had never been this way. I dialed the number, my heart pounding in my ears as the phone rang. After what felt like an eternity, a voice answered. "Hello, this is Maria from HR. How can I assist you today?" I tried to steady my voice, but it trembled as I spoke. "Hi, Maria. There's something wrong with my records. My name," I paused, swallowing the lump in my throat. "It's not right. It's been changed on every document, and I don't know why. Can you help me understand what happened?" There was a long pause on the other end. The silence stretched out, filling the space between us. When Maria finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost too calm. "I'm sorry, but I'm afraid there's been no mistake. Your name has always been new name. We have no record of any changes." I could feel the ground shifting beneath me. My mind raced. "No, you don't understand. My name isn't new name. I've been my original name my whole life. Why is everyone acting like this is normal?" Maria's voice softened, but there was a coldness to it now. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. Your name has always been new name. There's no reason for concern. Perhaps you're just confused." I felt a rush of anger and frustration, but there was also a growing sense of fear. Why couldn't anyone remember? Why was I the only one who seemed to notice? I hung up the phone, my hands trembling. The room felt smaller, suffocating. I couldn't stay here any longer. I needed to leave, to get away from the confusion, from the people who didn't remember me. I stood up from my desk and grabbed my bag, walking quickly toward the exit. But as I passed by the break room, I stopped. There was a conversation happening inside, and for some reason, I couldn't resist the urge to listen. I peeked inside through the small crack in the door. My coworkers were gathered around the table, chatting and laughing, but my attention was immediately drawn to something else. Something I hadn't noticed before. There, in the corner of the room, was a whiteboard with a list of names. It was a routine thing, a list of people scheduled for meetings, tasks, shifts. But as I looked closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. My name, the one that wasn't mine, was at the top of the list. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. How could this be happening? How could my name be on that board when it wasn't mine? I turned away from the break room, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The walls seemed to close in on me again, and I couldn't breathe. I needed to get out of this place. I needed to leave before it was too late. But just as I reached the door, I heard it. "Hey, new name, where are you going?" It was Sarah's voice, calling out to me from the other side of the office. Her voice was so casual, so familiar, like nothing was wrong. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I pushed open the door and stepped out into the hallway, my legs unsteady beneath me. The world outside seemed normal, the sounds of the city bustling around me, but I felt like I was walking in a dream. Everything was shifting, bending, changing around me, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep up. I stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the ground floor. As the doors closed, I glanced at my reflection in the mirrored walls. For the first time, I looked at myself with new eyes, unsure of what I would see. But what I saw wasn't me. The face staring back at me was the same, but the eyes were different, cold, unfamiliar. I looked at myself, trying to recognize the person in the reflection, but I couldn't. Who was I? The elevator jerked to a stop, and the doors opened with a soft ding. But I didn't step out. I couldn't. The reflection wasn't mine anymore. The elevator doors stood open, inviting me to step into the world below, but I couldn't move. My reflection had me frozen in place. I had never truly examined myself like this before, but now, with the name I didn't recognize and the eyes that didn't belong to me, everything felt wrong. The person in the mirror didn't feel like me. I raised my hand to touch my face, half expecting it to vanish, to be a trick, but the glass was cold and solid beneath my fingers. It was real, yet so strange. The woman in the reflection seemed almost distant, like a shadow of someone I used to be. I wasn't sure how much time passed as I stood there, staring at her. Finally, I stepped out of the elevator, but it felt like I wasn't really walking. My feet moved automatically, taking me through the building's lobby, past the busy front desk, and out the door. The city sounds hit me like a wave, the honking cars, the chatter of pedestrians, but none of it felt familiar anymore. I wasn't sure where I was anymore. I needed answers. I couldn't go back to the office, not like this, not with everything twisted so horribly. My mind was racing, but my body felt detached, as if it didn't belong to me. The air outside was cold, and I wrapped my jacket tighter around me, feeling a slight tremor run through my body. I walked quickly, my thoughts a blur. It wasn't just my name anymore. It was everything. The world around me had started to blur, to distort. My surroundings looked the same, but felt off. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a quiet dissonance. I made my way to a nearby cafe, hoping to clear my head, maybe to make sense of the madness. But as soon as I stepped inside, I froze. The barista, a young man with dark hair and a friendly smile, greeted me as though he had known me for years. "Hey, new name. The usual today?" My breath caught in my throat. I forced a smile, trying to act normal. "Yeah, sure," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He moved behind the counter without hesitation, preparing my coffee as though it was something we did every day. But how could he? I had never been here before. I was sure of that. And yet, he knew me. Knew my name. My hand trembled as I took the cup from him. It was warm, comforting in a way, but the moment I touched it, something about it felt wrong. Like it didn't belong to me. The scent of coffee that normally would have brought me comfort now felt like a foreign smell. I looked around the cafe, trying to ground myself, but everything seemed slightly out of focus. The people sitting at tables, chatting and sipping their drinks, all appeared the same, yet their faces seemed distant, as though I were viewing them from behind a veil. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I stepped out of the cafe, the cool air hitting my face as I walked down the street. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out, half expecting it to be a message from someone at work, or maybe even HR again. But when I unlocked the screen, my stomach dropped. There, at the top of the screen, was a notification. A reminder from my calendar, meeting with new name at 3 p.m. I blinked at the screen, feeling dizzy. The name again. It was everywhere, even in places it shouldn't be. But it wasn't just the name. It was the fact that no one seemed to acknowledge what was happening. No one seemed to notice how wrong it all was. I quickly swiped to my contacts list, searching for any trace of the name I used to have. But when I scrolled through, every single entry was listed under the new name. Every single one. I had no proof of my own identity. The people in my life, my friends, my family, were all gone, replaced by a version of me that I didn't know. Panic clawed at my chest, but I tried to remain calm. I couldn't lose myself completely. I couldn't let this place, this world, swallow me whole. I decided to go home. Maybe being in my own space would help. Maybe I could think clearly there. But as I turned to head in the direction of my apartment, something caught my eye. A familiar face standing on the sidewalk, staring at me. It was my neighbor, Mark. He had been living in the building across from mine for a while now, but I hadn't spoken to him much. But now, his gaze was fixed on me, and something about it made my skin crawl. There was a strange intensity in his eyes, like he knew something I didn't. Something that wasn't supposed to be. I approached him cautiously. "Hey, Mark," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice was shaky. He smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was thin, almost knowing. "Hi, new name. How's your day been?" The way he said it, so casually, like it was the most normal thing in the world, made my blood run cold. I didn't say anything for a moment, unsure of what to do. How did he know? Why did he say it like that? Before I could respond, Mark's expression shifted. It was so subtle, but I saw it, His smile faltered just for a second, and his eyes darkened. "You've been having some trouble with your name, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. I felt my stomach churn. How did he know? How could he? I took a step back, feeling a cold sweat break out on my skin. "What do you mean?" I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady. He glanced around, almost as if he were checking to make sure no one was listening. "It's happening to you, too, isn't it? The name, the changes." My breath hitched in my throat. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mark looked at me intently, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something dark and knowing. "You're not the only one," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've been replaced." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I stood there, frozen in place, the weight of his words sinking in. Replaced. What did he mean? Who was I really? I stood there, numb, my mind racing as Mark's words echoed in my head. "You've been replaced." The weight of his words settled over me like a suffocating blanket, smothering my every thought. How could he know? And why did he say it like it was so casual, as if it was a fact everyone knew except me? I stumbled back to my apartment, my steps robotic, like my body was moving without my permission. The world around me felt distant, like I was watching it through a foggy window. Nothing seemed real. The air felt thicker, colder. I could hear the faint hum of traffic, the distant chatter of people, but it all seemed muted, like a dream I couldn't wake from. When I reached my apartment building, I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so violently that I almost dropped them. I shoved the key into the lock and pushed the door open. The familiar scent of my apartment, wood, coffee, and the faint smell of old books should have been comforting. But now it felt wrong, foreign. The door clicked shut behind me, and I leaned against it, trying to steady myself. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, but everything felt hollow, like the sounds were being distorted in a way I couldn't explain. I needed answers. I couldn't keep living in this uncertainty. I walked into the living room and immediately froze. My reflection in the full-length mirror on the wall caught my eye, and I couldn't look away. For a moment, it felt like I was staring at someone else entirely. The person in the mirror, my reflection, looked like me, but there was something off about her. Something that didn't belong. I stepped closer, my breath shallow, and reached out to touch the glass. My fingers hovered above the surface, afraid of what might happen if I made contact. But I had to. I had to know. The moment my fingertips brushed the mirror, the room seemed to shift. The light flickered, and the sound of the clock ticking grew louder, more oppressive. I jerked my hand back, but it was too late. The reflection in the mirror twisted, its features distorting into something unrecognizable. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I was no longer sure what was real. Was the reflection real? Was I real? Or was I just a fragment of something that used to exist? I blinked and the mirror seemed to return to normal. My reflection was back, but the air felt charged now, thick with an unspoken tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had shifted in the space between reality and reflection. I turned away from the mirror, feeling dizzy. The world outside my apartment seemed too distant, too foreign. It was like I was no longer in control of my own life, like I was trapped in someone else's story, someone else's nightmare. I had to find Mark. He knew something. He had to know why this was happening, why everything in my life was slipping through my fingers like sand. He was the only one who seemed to understand what I was going through, the only one who could explain the impossible. But when I tried to leave my apartment, I froze at the door. The hallway outside was empty, just like it always was. But as my eyes scanned the familiar walls, I noticed something strange, something I hadn't seen before. There, on the wall opposite my door, was a picture. A framed photograph that I could have sworn wasn't there yesterday. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening as I examined the image. It was a photo of me, standing in front of my apartment building, smiling, only it wasn't me. I stared at the face in the photograph, feeling the cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. The woman in the picture had my face, but her eyes were different. Cold. Empty. She looked like me, but she wasn't. She couldn't be. I reached out to touch the glass of the frame, my fingers trembling. The moment I made contact, the air around me seemed to crackle. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath fog in front of me. The photo in the frame shifted, the image warping as though it were alive. It wasn't just the photo that was changing. The walls around me began to distort, bending in ways that didn't make sense. The hallway stretched out, growing longer, the edges of the walls curving. I could hear the sound of my heartbeat in my ears, pounding, drowning out everything else. I looked back at the photograph. The woman's smile grew wider, her eyes colder. She looked satisfied. I had to get out of there. I turned away from the wall, my mind spinning. But as I did, something caught my eye, another photograph, this one at the end of the hallway. I couldn't explain why, but I was drawn to it. It was a photo of the same woman, standing at the entrance of the building, holding a key. A key to my apartment. A key to my life. I moved toward it, almost against my will, my feet dragging as though the floor beneath me was pulling me in. I didn't want to look at it, didn't want to know what I would find, but I couldn't stop myself. The woman in the picture was smiling at me, her eyes gleaming with a strange, knowing satisfaction. I reached the photograph and touched the frame. The moment my fingers brushed the glass, the world around me tilted. The hallway spun, and the air around me thickened, suffocating. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, everything was shifting, warping, becoming something else entirely. I wasn't in my apartment building anymore. I wasn't even sure I was in the same reality. I was in a place where nothing made sense, where time and space bent like they were nothing but fragile threads. I was lost, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever find my way back. The woman's face stared back at me from the photograph, and I realized with a sudden, terrifying clarity, she wasn't just a reflection of me. She was me. But not the me I used to know. The me who had been replaced. And now, there was no way out. The world spun around me, the walls bending and stretching as if they were made of nothing more than paper. The light flickered, casting distorted shadows that seemed to breathe, to pulse with life. I stumbled backward, my head spinning. The hallway stretched on endlessly, the photographs multiplying, their faces growing stranger with every step. I couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in, tightening around me, squeezing the air from my lungs. My body felt heavier, like gravity itself had turned against me. I reached for my phone, desperate to ground myself in something familiar, but the screen was cracked, flickering with static. The image of my reflection, no, the woman who wasn't me, stared back at me, her smile wider, her eyes colder. I turned in a circle, looking for any escape, but all I saw were the photographs. They lined the walls, stretching on for what felt like miles, each one showing the same woman in different places, different positions. But the expression in her eyes, always cold, always knowing, was the same. I felt like I was losing myself. The woman in the photos was everywhere, creeping into every corner of my mind, taking over everything. Then I heard something. A faint sound, barely audible at first. It was soft, like a whisper, but it grew louder, clearer with every passing second. "Come closer." The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. It echoed in my ears, like a memory I couldn't quite reach. I looked around, searching for the source, but all I saw were the walls, the photographs, and the darkening space around me. "Come closer," the voice urged again, more insistent this time. I took a hesitant step forward, my legs unsteady beneath me. The voice felt like it was pulling me, guiding me towards something or someone. My instinct screamed at me to stop, to turn back, but I couldn't. The pull was too strong, like I was being drawn into a web I couldn't escape. With each step, the temperature dropped and the shadows grew deeper, more suffocating. The photographs seemed to watch me, their eyes following my every move. The air around me grew thick, and I could feel the weight of something unseen pressing in on me, suffocating me. I turned the corner at the end of the hallway, and there, at the far end, I saw a door. It was different from the others. It was solid, real, as if it belonged to another world altogether. The voice urged me forward, and I obeyed, my heart racing in my chest. As I reached for the door handle, I paused. The reflection of my hand, no, not my hand, hovered in the dark glass of the door. It was the woman's hand again. She was standing in front of me, her reflection moving before I did. I was no longer sure which one of us was real, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to open the door. I had to find the truth. I turned the handle, and the door swung open. Behind it was nothing but darkness. A black void, like the inside of a broken mirror, stretched endlessly before me. I stepped inside without hesitation, as if my feet had a mind of their own, and the door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into the void. For a moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that felt like it could swallow everything. But then, something moved in the dark. A figure appeared before me, slowly taking shape in the blackness. It was the woman again, but now she was standing in front of me, her features twisted and warped like a reflection in a cracked mirror. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only coldness. "You've finally come," she said, her voice echoing in the void. "I've been waiting for you." I tried to speak, but my voice failed me. My throat was dry, and my heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, the words barely escaping my lips. The woman laughed, a low, eerie sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Who am I?" she repeated, as if it were a joke. "I'm you, of course. I always have been." The words didn't make sense. How could she be me? She looked nothing like me, not anymore. Her smile twisted into something darker, something more sinister. "You're me," she said again, her voice softer now, more soothing, as if trying to calm me. "But you're not real. Not anymore. I've replaced you. I've taken your place." I shook my head, confusion flooding my thoughts. "No, that's not possible. I'm real. I'm me." She tilted her head, and for the first time, her eyes softened, almost sympathetically. "You were real," she said quietly. "But you're not anymore. Don't you see? You're just a fragment. A shadow." I stumbled back, my body trembling. I couldn't breathe. The darkness around me pressed in closer, suffocating. "No. I don't understand. What happened to me?" The woman's expression turned cold again. "You were replaced. Just like all the others. You didn't belong in this world. So I took your place. And now you'll never be able to leave." I backed away from her, my mind spinning. I needed to get out. I needed to wake up. This couldn't be real. But the void around me grew tighter, the darkness wrapping around me like a thick, suffocating blanket. I was trapped. Trapped in a world that wasn't mine, with a reflection that wasn't me. I could feel myself fading, slipping away, becoming just another lost piece of the twisted, broken reality I had entered. The last thing I heard before everything went black was her voice, soft, almost kind, but filled with a terrible finality. "Goodbye." And then everything went silent. Have you ever had the feeling that something isn't quite right, but you can't put your finger on it? You look at something familiar, but it's just off. Like your mind is playing tricks on you. That's how I felt that day in the metro. It was a regular afternoon, crowded as usual, the train humming steadily along the tracks. The familiar smell of stale air mixed with the faint scent of coffee from a nearby kiosk. I was standing by the pole, holding on with one hand, my thoughts drifting aimlessly. I had just finished work, tired but not exhausted, looking forward to getting home and collapsing into my couch. The train stopped with a jolt, and the doors slid open to let more passengers in. A wave of people entered, pushing and shoving their way onto the train. And then I saw him. At first, I thought it was just the exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. But no! It was him. It was Victor. My childhood friend. The one I hadn't seen in over 10 years. I couldn't believe it. I had to blink a few times, rub my eyes to make sure I wasn't imagining things. But there he was, standing just a few feet away, looking exactly the same. His messy brown hair, his familiar blue jacket, the faded jeans. He hadn't changed at all. Not even a little. I couldn't stop staring. We used to be inseparable. I had so many memories of us running around the neighborhood, laughing and getting into trouble. But time had passed, and we'd lost touch. We'd gone our separate ways, and I hadn't thought about him in years. And now, here he was, standing right in front of me, as though nothing had changed. I took a step toward him, my heart pounding in my chest. Maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it was just someone who looked like him. I wasn't sure, but I had to know. "Victor?" I said, my voice shaking. It felt strange to say his name after so many years. He didn't react at first. I thought maybe he hadn't heard me over the noise of the train, so I called out again, louder this time. "Victor." "It's me, Alex." This time, he turned his head, slowly, his eyes meeting mine. But there was something unsettling about his gaze. He didn't smile or react in the way I expected. Instead, his eyes were cold, almost distant, as if he didn't recognize me at all. For a moment, I froze, unsure of what to do. Maybe it wasn't him after all. Maybe it was someone else who just happened to look like Victor. But then he smiled. It was a small, almost imperceptible smile, but it was enough to make my stomach churn. It didn't feel like a warm, welcoming smile. It felt empty. "Hello, Alex," he said, his voice soft but flat, as though he were saying it to a stranger, not an old friend. I was taken aback. His voice sounded the same, but it didn't carry the same warmth that I remembered. It felt hollow, distant. "Victor, is it really you?" I asked, my voice cracking. What are you doing here? How have you been?" He didn't answer. Instead, he looked past me, his eyes darting around the train as though something had caught his attention. I followed his gaze, but all I saw were the other passengers, all of them minding their own business. When I looked back at him, he was already taking a step back, moving towards the door. His face remained expressionless, his movements stiff. "I have to go," he said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the train. And with that, he turned and walked towards the exit. I stood there, frozen, watching him disappear into the crowd. My mind raced, my heart pounding in my chest. What had just happened? Was it really him? Or had I imagined the whole thing? I wanted to follow him, to stop him and ask what was going on, but I couldn't move. The train started moving again, picking up speed as we left the station. I looked toward the door where Victor had vanished, but he was already gone, swallowed up by the crowd. I stood there, feeling a chill spread through me as the noise of the metro seemed to fade into the background. Something didn't feel right. Something was wrong. The way he had looked at me, it wasn't the Victor I knew. The train stopped at the next station, and I stumbled off, my mind reeling. Was it really him? Or had my mind conjured up a memory, twisted it into something it wasn't? I shook my head, trying to push the thought away, but I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had just changed, something had just slipped out of reach. I turned around to look back at the train, but it had already pulled away. The platform was empty. I was alone. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. Somewhere in that crowd, Victor was still there, watching me. Or maybe he wasn't. Maybe he was never really there at all. The more I thought about it, the less sure I was of what I had seen. And the more I wondered, what if he had never been there at all? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing my grip on reality. The encounter in the metro replayed in my mind over and over, each time more unsettling than the last. I kept asking myself, had it really happened? The next day, I tried to carry on with my usual routine. The commute, the endless stream of people, the same droning sounds of the trains and platforms, it all felt so normal. Too normal. But something had shifted. The world around me seemed distant, like I was watching it through a fogged-up window. It wasn't the same, and I wasn't sure why. I walked into the office, trying to focus, trying to pretend that nothing was wrong. But even as I greeted my coworkers, I kept glancing around, half expecting to see Victor standing by the coffee machine or sitting at a nearby desk. Maybe I'm just imagining things, I thought. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more I felt the weight of that unease settling in. By lunchtime, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to talk about it. I called my old friend Sarah, someone who had known Victor as well, back in the day. She was always the practical one, the one who kept everything grounded in reality. "Sarah, you won't believe what happened yesterday," I said as soon as she answered the phone. "I think I saw Victor." There was a long pause on the other end, and I could hear her shuffling papers before she spoke. "Victor? The Victor you used to hang out with?" Are you sure it was him? Yes. It had to be him. He looked the same. He didn't look like he aged a day. But when I tried to talk to him, it was like he didn't even know who I was. My voice trembled as I relayed what had happened. Sarah mused. You said he was acting strange? Maybe you're just remembering things wrong. I mean, it's been so long. People change, even if they don't show it on the surface. I know, but it felt wrong. Like something was off. It didn't feel like the Victor I knew, I said, my voice growing more agitated. Well, did you actually speak to him? Like, did you two have a conversation? She asked, clearly trying to make sense of the situation. No, I said, my chest tightening. He just walked away. Vanished into the crowd, like he never existed. There was another long silence on the other end of the line. Alex, you're stressing yourself out. Maybe you're overthinking it. It's probably just some stranger who looks like Victor. You know how our memories can play tricks on us, right? I wasn't so sure. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Sarah's explanation didn't feel right. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. There was something deeper, something darker about the whole encounter. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, the image of Victor's face dancing in my mind. His cold smile. The way he seemed so empty. I got up, went to the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water, trying to calm my racing thoughts. But then, something happened that made my blood run cold. From the kitchen window, I could see the street below. It was dark outside, the streetlights casting long, pale shadows across the pavement. And there, standing under one of the lights, was a figure. A man with messy brown hair and a blue jacket. At first, I thought it was just someone else, someone who happened to look like Victor. But as I stared at the figure, I felt my heart skip a beat. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring up at my apartment. It wasn't the way someone would look if they were waiting for a bus or a friend. It was as though he was waiting for me. I felt a chill wash over me, and before I could make sense of what I was seeing, the figure turned and walked away into the shadows. I watched him disappear, my breath caught in my throat. My mind raced with questions. Had he been there all along? Was he following me? I couldn't be sure, but the feeling that Victor, or whatever that was still out there, lurking in the shadows, gnawed at me. I knew I had to find him, figure out what was happening, but I was afraid. What if this was all a twisted game? A nightmare I couldn't escape? The next morning, I decided to go back to the metro. I had to know. I had to find some kind of answer, even if it meant confronting whatever it was that had taken Victor's place, or whatever Victor had become. I stood at the same platform where I had seen him, feeling the hum of the train beneath my feet. The same sense of unease crept over me, but this time I couldn't turn back. The train arrived, its doors sliding open with a hiss, and I stepped inside, my heart pounding. I scanned the crowd, but there was no sign of Victor. No sign of anyone familiar. I got off at the same stop, walked through the tunnel, and into the main hall. The crowd was as thick as ever, the noise of footsteps echoing off the walls. But then, something caught my eye. There, at the far end of the hall, I saw him again. Victor. He was standing still, staring at the wall as if he were waiting for something. Or someone. I took a step toward him, but as I did, the crowd seemed to shift. The people around me began moving faster, brushing past me with hurried, almost unnatural energy. I tried to push my way through, but the crowd felt like a wall, a moving sea of strangers, and Victor was already slipping out of view. I started to run, my breath shallow and frantic. I had to reach him. I had to ask him what was happening. But by the time I reached the end of the hall, he was gone. Disappeared. Like he had never been there at all. The lights flickered, the sound of the train's engine growing louder, almost deafening. And I realized, with a sudden, horrifying clarity, that I wasn't sure if I was chasing a person or a memory. The days that followed felt like I was moving through a fog. I tried to return to my normal life, tried to forget the strange occurrences with Victor. But every corner I turned, every fleeting glimpse of someone familiar, made my pulse race. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there, waiting for me. It didn't help that I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Every time I passed a reflective surface, a window or a glass door, I'd catch a glimpse of a figure, someone standing just out of sight, always in the corner of my vision. But when I turned, there was never anyone there. My mind was starting to betray me, and I was afraid to trust it. I kept thinking about the subway. The last time I saw Victor, he had vanished so easily, like a ghost. The crowd had swallowed him up, and yet, the more I thought about it, the more I realized something didn't sit right. He hadn't disappeared in the usual way, like someone simply walking away. He'd faded into the crowd, almost as if he was never really there. The whole thing had begun to feel like a dream. And that night, I found myself standing at the same subway station once again. The air felt thicker this time, heavy with a strange energy. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if the world around me had shifted, like the laws of time and space didn't apply here anymore. I was no longer sure what was real. I stood at the platform, waiting for the train, my heart hammering in my chest. The fluorescent lights above buzzed intermittently, casting a flickering glow that only made everything feel more distorted. Then, I saw him again. This time, it wasn't a fleeting glimpse. Victor was standing at the far end of the platform, his back turned to me, his familiar blue jacket the only thing that anchored me to reality. I could hardly believe it. It was him, just like before, unchanging, untouched by time. But I didn't feel relief. I felt fear, deep, gnawing fear. I started walking toward him, my legs heavy, each step dragging me deeper into an unsettling sense of déjà vu. I called out his name, my voice trembling, barely above a whisper. Victor. Victor. He didn't turn around. His back remained rigid, unmoving, like a statue. I reached out, but the closer I got, the more disorienting the world became. The noise of the trains faded, and the floor beneath me seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. The shadows around us stretched and warped in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I was almost there, just a few steps away, when something happened. The air around me suddenly grew colder, sharper. The lights above us flickered more violently, casting harsh, unnatural shadows. Victor turned around slowly, his face different. It wasn't that his features had changed, his face was still the same, but it felt wrong. His eyes were hollow, as if something was missing behind them. His lips parted slightly, and for a moment I thought he was going to speak. But instead, he raised his hand. Not as a gesture of greeting, but in a slow, deliberate motion, like he was blocking me from coming any closer. His fingers were stiff, too stiff, and his nails, long and jagged, looked almost as though they were growing. I froze. Fear gripped me, and the world seemed to close in on me, the walls of the station pressing in like they were alive. Victor's presence became suffocating. I tried to step back, but it felt like the floor had become sticky, my feet glued to the ground. "Victor," I choked out again, my voice cracking. What is happening?" His head tilted slightly, as though he were considering my question. Then, he whispered something so softly that I almost didn't hear it. "You shouldn't have come." The words were like ice, chilling me to my core. And before I could react, before I could even process what he had said, he took a step backward. The moment he did, I felt the ground shift beneath me, the platform suddenly tilting, warping like the surface of water. And then, just like that, he vanished. One moment, he was there. The next, he was gone. The crowd on the platform had disappeared as well, and I was alone in a silent, empty void. I looked around, disoriented, struggling to make sense of what was happening. Where was everyone? What had just occurred? There were no trains. No people. The only sound now was the echo of my breath in the hollow, distorted space. I stumbled backward, my legs giving way beneath me. I fell to the floor, my palms scraping against the cold tile as I tried to pull myself back up. My heart was racing, and I could barely catch my breath. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating me from all sides. And then, from the far end of the platform, I heard a sound. Soft at first, almost imperceptible. But it grew louder. The sound of footsteps. I turned, my body frozen in place. But there was no one there. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty station. They were coming closer, inch by inch. And then, I heard Victor's voice again, low and distorted, as if it was coming from all directions at once. "You shouldn't have come, Alex." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The world around me felt like it was closing in, warping, bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The darkness seemed to stretch, pulling me into it, and I could do nothing but wait for whatever was about to happen next. Suddenly, the echoing footsteps stopped. A silence, thicker than any I'd felt before, settled over the station. And in that silence, a cold, suffocating darkness enveloped me. Then, I felt something cold brush against my skin, a hand, not Victor's, but something else, something darker. I gasped, trying to pull away, but there was nowhere to go. The hand tightened its grip. And I realized, with growing horror, that this wasn't just a meeting with an old friend. This was something far worse. I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt like it was constricting, my breath trapped in my chest. The hand on my arm was cold, unnaturally cold, and it felt like it was pulling me deeper into the darkness that had swallowed the platform. The lights flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging the station into total blackness. My heart pounded in my ears as I struggled, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. The air was thick, damp with the smell of something old and decayed. It reminded me of the basement in my childhood home, the one I had always been afraid to enter. But this was worse. Much worse. This place, whatever it was not meant to exist. I twisted my body, trying to break free from the grip, but the hand tightened. Its fingers were long, almost unnaturally so, and I could feel them sinking into my skin, not just gripping, but connecting with something deep inside me. My mind screamed in protest, but my body seemed to obey the invisible force that was dragging me deeper into the abyss. I had to get out. In desperation, I clawed at the floor, trying to find something, anything, to hold on to. My fingers brushed against the cold tiles, but the darkness was so thick it felt like I was blind, like I was drowning. My entire body tensed with fear. This wasn't just some strange hallucination. It wasn't a nightmare. This was real. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my blood freeze, a figure in the darkness. It was moving toward me, slowly, deliberately. At first, I thought it was Victor again, but as it stepped into the faintest strip of light from the broken fixtures above, I realized it wasn't him. It wasn't anything human. The figure was tall, its outline hazy, like smoke twisting in the air. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like it was struggling to maintain its form. It had no distinct features, no face, just a vague mass of shifting shadows. But it was there, and it was moving closer. I could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, drawing closer and closer. I could hear its breathing, slow and raspy, like a death rattle, and it was growing louder with every passing second. In a panic, I finally managed to yank my arm away from the cold grip, but the force behind it was so powerful that it sent me crashing to the ground. I hit the floor hard, my vision spinning as I scrambled to my feet. My legs felt weak, uncoordinated, but I pushed myself forward, stumbling through the darkness. I couldn't stop. I had to get out. I dashed forward, my heart pounding so loudly in my chest that it drowned out the sound of the figure's breathing. I didn't care where I was going. I just had to get away from it. I ran blindly through the pitch-black station, the air growing colder with each step, the walls pressing in on me as though they were closing in, ready to crush me. But then, suddenly, the ground beneath me seemed to shift again, and I felt like I was falling into a void, like the platform had dissolved beneath me. I reached out, trying to grab onto anything, but my fingers met nothing but emptiness. The fall felt endless. But then, as if by some miracle, my feet hit solid ground again. I gasped, disoriented, and looked around, trying to make sense of where I had landed. I was no longer in the subway. I was in a different place entirely. The walls were made of stone, cold, gray stone that seemed to stretch upwards forever. There were no lights, no signs, no windows. Only shadows that loomed larger the further I looked. I felt as though I had crossed over into a realm that existed beyond the boundaries of time and space, a place where the laws of reality no longer applied. And I wasn't alone. The figure I had seen earlier was standing at the far end of the hallway, its shape shifting, its presence filling the air with a palpable sense of dread. It was waiting for me. And then, as though it had sensed my awareness, it started to move. Slowly at first, like it was testing the air, but then with growing urgency, its movements becoming faster, more erratic. I turned to run, but there was nowhere to go. The hallway stretched on forever, the walls narrowing in a way that made it impossible to escape. My legs felt like they were moving through molasses, my body heavy, weighed down by something I couldn't explain. The figure was getting closer now, and I could hear its breath, ragged, uneven, as though it was struggling to keep itself together. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't breathe. The air in this place was suffocating, thick and full of something wrong. And then, I felt it again, the cold hand on my shoulder, the one that had touched me before. I couldn't escape it. It was everywhere. It was inside me, pulling me further into the darkness. I turned around, my eyes locked on the shifting figure in front of me, and I finally understood. This wasn't Victor. This wasn't even a real person. This was something else, a thing that had taken the form of a person I knew, someone I trusted, someone I thought I could find comfort in. But it was a lie. A cruel, twisted lie. It wasn't real. The thing raised its hand, and I could hear its voice again. This time, it wasn't Victor's voice. It was something deeper, darker, a voice that echoed from the very walls of this place. You shouldn't have come, Alex. And then, in that moment, I realized the terrible truth. I wasn't going to leave this place. This place wasn't meant for me. It wasn't meant for anyone. I had crossed a line, and now I was trapped on the other side. The voice lingered in the air like a whisper from a nightmare, the words curling around my consciousness, sinking deep into my mind. You shouldn't have come, Alex. I couldn't escape it. The feeling that something had already taken root in this place, something that wasn't meant to exist in the world I knew. I stumbled backward, my mind spinning with 100 impossible thoughts, but none of them made sense. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't. The shadows around me seemed to warp, to shift as though they were alive, pulling at the edges of my vision. The figure, the one that had taken the form of Victor, was now standing right in front of me, too close, its shape swirling in a way that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a person, it was something far older, far more ancient. You've crossed the line, the voice echoed again, colder than before, like the air itself had turned to ice. And now you belong to us. I could feel its presence closing in, surrounding me, an oppressive weight pushing down on my chest, crushing the breath from my lungs. My hands went instinctively to my throat, as if trying to pull the air back into my body, but nothing helped. The darkness was all-consuming, and I could feel it pulling me deeper, further into the abyss. I had to fight back. I had to escape. I ran, though I wasn't sure where to. The walls of this place, this other place, were closing in on me, the stone growing tighter, more claustrophobic with each step. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to find the exit, but I knew in my bones that there was no escape. Not here. And then I saw it, a flicker of light, distant but unmistakable, coming from down the corridor. A train. I wasn't sure why, but the train felt like the only thing that could save me. It felt like a way out, a path back to the world I knew, a chance to undo whatever had gone wrong. I ran toward it, ignoring the way the shadows whispered my name, ignoring the creeping cold that continued to follow me. My feet slapped against the stone floor, echoing in the silence that felt unnatural, wrong. Each step felt like a mile, but I couldn't stop now. I had to reach the train. The train came into view, a dull, flickering light casting long shadows across the tracks. It was like any other subway train, but something was off about it. The carriages were empty, and the doors remained open, waiting. I could hear the faint hum of the train, but there was no sound of the usual rattle, no hiss of the brakes or the screech of the wheels on the tracks. It was like the train was frozen in time. I reached the doors and stumbled inside, my heart pounding in my chest, my breathing ragged. As I stepped into the empty carriage, the doors slammed shut behind me with an almost deafening finality. I turned to face the inside of the train. Empty seats. The lights flickered above me, casting an eerie glow across the walls. There was no conductor, no passengers. It was just me, alone with the quiet hum of the train and the overwhelming sense that I was being watched. But as I looked down the length of the train, I saw something that froze me in place, Victor's face, staring at me from the far end of the carriage. He was standing perfectly still, just as he had on the platform, but this time there was no warmth in his eyes, no recognition. The figure in front of me had no features, no real expression, just that unblinking stare, cold and empty. I couldn't tell if it was the real Victor anymore. I didn't even know if he had ever been real to begin with. The train jerked to life, and the walls around me seemed to melt into the darkness, the light flickering erratically, as though the world outside the train was shifting in ways I couldn't comprehend. The tracks were no longer familiar. The tunnel around us was dark and twisting, stretching in impossible directions, as though the train was speeding through some kind of warped reality. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my body felt frozen, rooted to the spot, unable to move. It felt like the train was no longer just taking me somewhere, it was pulling me into something. The train hurtled through the tunnel, the world outside warping and distorting with each passing second. The air inside the train grew thick with the same suffocating presence I had felt on the platform, the same cold hand on my shoulder. It was the same feeling, the sensation of being pulled into a place where I didn't belong, where time and space didn't follow the rules. I looked up and saw Victor again, his form wavering like smoke. It was still him, but not him. The voice in my head, the one that had whispered my name, returned again. "You can never leave," it said. "Once you've seen this place, once you've crossed over, you're one of us." The train accelerated, faster now, and I could feel the walls closing in, the tunnel narrowing, the air growing colder. Then, with a violent jolt, the train came to a stop. I looked out the window, my breath fogging the glass. There was no station, no sign of life, just endless darkness beyond the glass. I felt a cold rush of dread. This wasn't where I had been before. This wasn't the world I knew. The doors opened with a hiss, and I heard the voice again. "This is your stop, Alex. Welcome home." I turned, but the train had already disappeared. I was alone again. Have you ever stumbled upon something that you were never supposed to find? Something that changed the way you saw the world, or even yourself? I had been at my new job for just a few weeks when it happened. At first, it felt like a typical office, bland walls, the constant hum of computers, and the steady rhythm of phones ringing and keyboards clacking. I was still adjusting to the environment, still getting used to the faces of my new colleagues, the buzz of coffee machines, the occasional burst of laughter over inside jokes I didn't yet understand. But there was something off about this place. Something that gnawed at me. It all started on an afternoon like any other. I had spent most of the day processing reports and sorting through stacks of paperwork that seemed endless when I noticed it. A small brass key tucked beneath a pile of old files. It was an unusual key, unlike the others I had seen around the office. It wasn't for any of the filing cabinets or the storage closets. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It didn't belong to any of the locks I'd seen, and there was no label, no indication of what it opened. Curiosity got the better of me. I tucked the key into my pocket, deciding to investigate later. By the time the workday ended, the office had emptied out, leaving only a few stragglers. I stayed behind, finishing up the last of my tasks, my mind preoccupied with the key. I knew I had to find out what it unlocked. There was something almost magnetic about it. I wandered the halls, searching for a door or a drawer that might match the key. I didn't expect much. After all, what could a forgotten key in an office really lead to? But as I passed by the storage room, something caught my eye. A narrow door tucked away behind a stack of cardboard boxes. It was hidden, almost as though it didn't belong there. No one had mentioned this room during my orientation, and I was sure I hadn't seen it before. The door was old, worn, and out of place amidst the otherwise modern decor of the office. My heart raced as I approached, the key still clenched tightly in my hand. I inserted it into the lock, feeling the smooth turn of the mechanism as the door creaked open. Inside, the room was dark, the air stale with dust and neglect. But what caught my attention wasn't the room itself, it was the cabinet. A tall, imposing metal cabinet sitting against the far wall. It was locked, the rusted lock barely visible beneath layers of grime. My hand trembled as I reached for the key and inserted it into the lock. There was a click, and the door swung open with an eerie groan. The moment I stepped inside, I felt a chill run through me. The room was unlike anything I had expected. It was filled with old filing cabinets and shelves, but the strange part was the records, dozens of them, neatly arranged but seemingly untouched by time. I pulled out one of the folders, feeling the weight of it in my hands. The papers inside were yellowed, the ink faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was my name. I felt my heart stop. My name? What was this? It couldn't be. These records, they weren't just records. They were events. Events that had happened, events that were happening right now. I flipped through the pages, each one more disturbing than the last. The dates were current, and the entries were so detailed that it felt like I was reading a script for my life. The entries seemed to be following me, noting things I hadn't shared with anyone. How was that possible? Who had written this? Why was this in an office no one seemed to know about? I continued to scan the papers, but the further I went, the more unnerving it became. The events described in these records weren't just about my work, they were about things I hadn't even done yet. There were entries about my conversations with colleagues, about meetings I hadn't attended, about choices I hadn't made. How could anyone have known these things? And then I saw it. The most recent entry. It was written in bold, red ink, Alex will find the cabinet. He will open it. And then it will be too late. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and the room seemed to close in on me. I dropped the folder, stumbling backward, my heart pounding. This couldn't be real. I couldn't just be reading about my own future. The idea that someone, or something, had been watching me, planning my every move, was unbearable. Suddenly, I heard a sound, a faint rustling noise behind me. I turned, but the room was empty. Just the filing cabinets. Just the shelves of forgotten records. And the cold, unsettling feeling that something was watching me. The door slammed shut behind me, and the lock clicked into place. I was trapped. I stood frozen in the dark room, heart hammering in my chest. My breath came out in sharp, shallow bursts. The eerie silence seemed to press in on me, almost suffocating. The key was still in my pocket, the weight of it now feeling more like a threat than an answer. How had the door closed on its own? I could have sworn I'd left it open. My pulse raced as I reached for the handle, trying to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. The lock had clicked into place. I pulled harder, then stopped, suddenly aware that something felt very wrong. The air was colder now, as if something invisible was filling the space with a heavy presence. I stepped back from the door, glancing around the room. The filing cabinets loomed like silent sentinels, their contents still unread. I needed answers. What was this place? Who had written these records? The idea of someone, or something, having such intimate knowledge of my life was beyond unsettling. The sensation of being watched returned, intensifying as I reached for the nearest drawer, almost instinctively. It was a mistake. As soon as my hand touched the metal, a strange vibration passed through the drawer. It wasn't physical, but it was palpable. A hum, deep and resonating, as though the entire room was alive. My fingers recoiled. Something in the air shifted. I could feel it, the presence, getting closer. A whisper in the back of my mind urged me to leave, to get out, but the pull of the cabinet was stronger. I forced myself to open the drawer. The records inside were stacked neatly, each one labeled with dates, names, and events. I slid one out, feeling its weight in my hand. It was a thin folder, not as full as the others, but I could see the same handwriting on the cover, Alex's final decision. My stomach twisted. Inside was only a single page, but it was enough to send a wave of dread through me. The text was short, to the point. Alex will open the drawer. He will find the truth. But he cannot escape. I felt the room closing on me again, my head spinning. I couldn't breathe. I looked back at the filing cabinets, now feeling like a maze of forgotten stories. Each drawer contained a record of my life, but the ones that seemed to matter most were the ones that had yet to happen. What kind of place was this? The noise was back, a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere in the room. I whirled around, searching the shadows. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. My mind raced for an explanation. Was this some sort of psychological experiment? A prank by my coworkers? But how could they have known? How could they have predicted everything that had happened? Then, a voice, soft but clear, spoke from behind me, its tone low and unsettling. You shouldn't have opened it. I spun around, eyes wide, my heart now pounding in my ears. There, standing in the doorway, was someone I hadn't expected. It was my colleague, Tom. But his face was pale, his eyes hollow, as if he hadn't slept in days. Tom? I whispered, barely able to believe what I was seeing. How did you? You shouldn't have opened it, he repeated, his voice now trembling. He stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate, as if every step took enormous effort. What are you talking about? I asked, trying to steady my breath. Tom, what is this place? Why am I here? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced nervously around the room as though the walls themselves might be listening. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, he said, It's not real. None of it is. My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of his words. What was he saying? What did he mean? He continued, his eyes darting to the file in my hand. Those records, they aren't just about you. They're about everyone. But they only show you what's meant to happen. It's a loop. And once you've seen it, you can't escape. What do you mean, a loop? I asked, the words barely making sense. Why are you here? How do you know all this? He shook his head slowly, his expression tortured. I've been here too long. They always know. They watch. And they make sure it happens. What happens? I asked, my voice shaking. Tom stepped closer, his face inches from mine, his breath cold against my skin. It doesn't matter, he said, his voice suddenly flat, emotionless. Once you've found the key, there's no going back. The room felt smaller now. The air was thick, suffocating, and I realized I couldn't hear anything anymore, not the hum of the office outside, not the distant sound of footsteps from the hallway. Just silence. And then, as if in response to that silence, the voice returned. The whisper from before. It's too late for you, Alex. My eyes shot to the corner of the room where a dark shadow had formed. It was growing, twisting, slowly taking shape. The presence was overwhelming, suffocating. I tried to move, to run, but my legs felt heavy, like they were stuck in place. My chest tightened, the room spinning around me. Tom's eyes widened in fear as the figure in the corner took form. He stepped back, stumbling, as if he recognized it too. "No, no, not now," he muttered, but his words were lost in the growing cacophony of whispers. I turned to the door, desperate to escape, but it was already too late. The room was no longer just a room. It was something else, something alive, watching me, closing in. The shadows crept toward me, and I felt the cold fingers of something unseen wrap around my throat. The key, the records, the door, they had all led me here. And I was trapped. I gasped for air, my lungs struggling against the pressure tightening around my chest. The darkness in the room felt like it was closing in, pushing against me, suffocating me. The figure in the corner, a formless mass of shadows and whispers, inched closer with every passing second. I could hear its presence, soft, shuffling footsteps that didn't quite make contact with the floor. It was moving, and I couldn't escape. My eyes locked onto Tom, who was now pressing himself against the wall, his body trembling. He knew this thing, this presence. He wasn't fighting it. He wasn't even trying to run. His gaze was distant, as if he had given up on the idea of survival long ago. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the mounting pressure. "What is it? What is this?" But Tom didn't respond. His lips were moving, but no sound came out. Instead, there was a low hum, like a radio tuning into a station just out of reach. It was coming from the figure. The shadows seemed to absorb the sound, growing louder, more oppressive. I tried to push myself away from the wall, away from the figure, but my legs were frozen, my feet rooted to the spot. The key in my pocket felt heavier now, like a weight pulling me deeper into whatever nightmare this was. My mind raced, desperately trying to find a way out, but all the thoughts were jumbled, mixed with panic. Then, the whisper returned, clearer this time. "You can't escape, Alex." I spun toward the voice, my heart thundering. It wasn't just in my head anymore. The figure spoke, its form growing clearer. It was a silhouette, a tall, thin shape that seemed to ripple with the darkness around it, like it was part of the very air. Its features were indistinct, no face, no hands, only shadows. It was the embodiment of emptiness, of things lost and forgotten. I opened my mouth to speak, to beg for answers, but nothing came out. The figure took another step forward, and I felt a chill wash over me, colder than any winter night. It wasn't just temperature, it was a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to freeze me from the inside out. "You shouldn't have found it." The words echoed around the room, vibrating in the very air, as though the walls themselves were speaking. I tried to move again, to escape, but my body refused to obey. My hands were shaking, my fingers clutching the edge of the desk for support. Then, like a spark igniting a fire, something inside me snapped. The instinct for survival kicked in. I couldn't just stand here, paralyzed by fear. I had to act. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the cold metal of the key. It was still there, pulsing with an almost unnatural energy. As soon as I touched it, the shadows seemed to recoil, as if it were aware of the key's power. But I had no idea what to do with it. I held the key out in front of me, almost as if I expected it to shine, to offer me some kind of solution. The figure hissed, a sound like dry leaves rustling in the wind. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, almost pleading. "Give it to us." The voice wasn't just one now. It was multiple voices, overlapping and indistinguishable from one another. They all seemed to come from the same place, from the shadow itself, yet from everywhere at once. The room began to spin, and my head was filled with a sense of vertigo, as though gravity no longer made sense. I backed up, still clutching the key. It was the only thing that had ever made sense in this twisted reality. It was the only thing that could help me. Then, in a flash of understanding, I realized what I had to do. I had to confront the shadow. It had been waiting for me to understand, to see the truth. It wasn't just a presence in the room, it was a part of me. The records, the cabinet, the key, it all led here. To this moment. To this choice. I had no idea if I could survive it, but I knew one thing for sure. If I didn't face it now, it would consume me, piece by piece. I took a deep breath, my hand still gripping the key, and stepped toward the shadow. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. They clawed at my mind, at my resolve. "You cannot win," the shadow hissed. "You are already ours." I didn't stop. My legs were trembling, but I forced myself forward, the key held tightly in my hand, my body moving on instinct. The figure loomed before me, the air thick with its presence. It felt like it was all around me, suffocating, watching. And then, just as I reached out with the key, everything stopped. The whispers ceased. The cold vanished. The figure, it was gone. The room was still again, silent. I stood there, breathless, my heart racing. I looked around, but nothing had changed. The shadows still filled the corners of the room, and the cabinet remained in front of me, its drawers empty, as if nothing had happened. Except for the key. It was no longer in my hand. I turned quickly, searching the room, but there was no sign of it. It had disappeared. Suddenly, I wasn't alone anymore. Tom was standing behind me, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. It was as if he couldn't speak. And then, something I never expected happened. The door to the archive, the one that had closed earlier, creaked open. The same drawer that I had opened earlier was now different. The records, which had once been unreadable, were now clearly visible. The names and dates were all there, written in the same neat handwriting, but something was off. The records showed not just my past, but my future. And there, in bold letters, was my name. Alex's final decision. But there was no decision left to make. I stood frozen, staring at the records. My name, written in bold, black letters, seemed to burn into my eyes. Alex's final decision. The words echoed in my mind, repeating over and over as if they were a mantra, a warning. The room, once so familiar, now felt like a maze of shadows and whispers, all converging on me, suffocating me. Tom was still behind me, his face a ghostly mask of fear, his eyes wide with a mix of confusion and horror. But I couldn't tear my gaze away from the records. My future, was written there, laid out for me to see. I reached out hesitantly, my fingers trembling as they brushed the pages. They were cool to the touch, but as I flipped through them, each page felt heavier, as though the weight of knowledge was pressing down on me, forcing me to confront something I wasn't ready to face. The entries were all about me, my work, my life, my choices. But there was something unsettling in the details. The decisions I thought I had made were written as if they had already happened, as if they were never mine to begin with. I paused on a page, my breath catching in my throat. It described an event that hadn't happened yet, something I had only thought about in passing. The words were chilling. Alex will enter the archive at precisely 10:43 p.m. He will find the key, and he will see the truth. But it is not the truth he expects. I staggered backward, the page slipping from my fingers. How could it know? How could these records predict everything? Every single step I had taken, every decision I had made, was laid bare in front of me. It was as if someone, or something, had already lived my life for me, mapping out every moment. Tom's voice, hoarse and barely above a whisper, broke through the haze of my thoughts. Alex, you don't have to do this. It's too late. I turned slowly to face him, the words stinging my ears. What do you mean it's too late? What is all this? Tom shook his head, his hands trembling. You're trapped. This is how it always ends. You open the door, you see the truth, and then it consumes you. Consumes me? I asked, my voice rising. What are you talking about, Tom? What do you know about this? Tom took a step back, his eyes darting nervously around the room. It's not just about the archive, Alex. It's about the key. It's about what happens when you unlock the door. You can't change anything once you've seen it. Once you've seen your future, it's too late. You'll be stuck in this loop forever. I felt a cold wave wash over me. His words made sense, but they didn't. How could they? How could I have walked into this place, found this key, and not expected some kind of price to pay? But what was this loop he was talking about? What exactly was I trapped in? I turned back to the records, flipping through them feverishly. More pages, more details of my life, things I hadn't even thought of yet, decisions that were yet to come. The future was already set. I could see it now, written in black and white. And it wasn't a future I wanted to live. The sound of the door creaking behind me snapped me back to reality. My heart raced. I spun around, but the door had already opened wide on its own. The faintest hint of a shadow slipped through the crack, and I felt a presence, cold, unfamiliar, and yet I knew it. The shadow from before. It was here. It moved like smoke, winding its way through the room, filling the space with its suffocating presence. Tom's face contorted with terror, his hands rising to shield his eyes, but I couldn't look away. I could feel it, its power, its hold over me. The shadow wasn't just a thing in the room. It was connected to the key, to the records, to my fate. It was the force that had written my life, that had controlled every step I took. And now, it was waiting for me to make the final choice. You can't escape, the shadow whispered. Its voice was a low hum, barely a sound but thick with menace. You are already part of this. You always have been. I looked at Tom, who was shrinking into the corner, his eyes wide, pleading. Alex, please. Don't. But I had already made up my mind. I had no choice but to face this. I could either accept what was written, what had already happened, or I could break free. The key was in my hand again, its cold weight heavy in my palm. But there was something different about it now. It didn't feel like a key to an archive. It felt like a key to everything. I stepped toward the shadow, ignoring Tom's desperate calls. I had to end this. I couldn't go on, knowing what was coming. The key in my hand began to glow, a soft, pulsating light. The shadow recoiled, as if it could feel the energy, the shift in the air. But as I approached, the shadow whispered again, and the words sank deep into my mind, "You cannot change what is already done." I stopped in my tracks, the words hanging in the air like a curse. Could I really change anything? Could I escape this cycle? Or was I doomed to relive this moment forever? I took a deep breath, the decision weighing on me more heavily than ever. This was it. The end. The final moment. And just as I raised the key to the shadow, everything went black. The world around me spun into darkness. The cold grip of the shadow had vanished, but in its place, an eerie silence settled. My breath came in shallow gasps, and for a long moment, I couldn't move. The key, still clutched tightly in my hand, now felt almost weightless, as if it no longer had a purpose. Was it over? I strained my senses, trying to make out any sound, any clue to what had just happened. But there was nothing. No hum of the fluorescent lights above, no faint shuffling from the hall outside. The stillness was absolute, as if I had been pulled out of time itself. Then, slowly, the silence began to shift. A soft sound, like the turning of a page, broke through the quiet. I turned toward it, but no one was there. The records, had they been erased? Had the future I'd seen been wiped away? I blinked, and in that instant, the room around me seemed to blur, as if reality itself was flickering. My eyes darted around. Tom was gone. The door, once wide open, was now shut tight, as though it had never moved. What was going on? I stumbled forward, my mind racing. The floor beneath me felt uneven, as if the building itself was shifting, stretching in a way I couldn't comprehend. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with each beat of my heart. I reached for the doorknob and twisted, but the door wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, but still, nothing. I tried to think, what had I learned? What had I seen in those records? I hadn't seen the full picture, had I? Was it all a test? A twisted game, and I was its pawn? No, I refused to believe that. There had to be a way out. A choice still left for me to make. I looked down at the key again. It was no longer glowing, but there was something about it that still felt alive, still pulsing with energy. Maybe it wasn't the end. Maybe it was just another beginning. A sudden thought struck me. The key. Could it open more than just the door? Could it open the space around me? My mind raced through the possibilities, each more unbelievable than the last. But something inside me, something I couldn't quite explain, told me that it was the key to more than just physical doors. I lifted it once more, the metal smooth against my palm. The room flickered again, and this time I knew it wasn't my imagination. The very air shimmered, bending, stretching. I pushed the key forward, not toward the door, but into the air itself. At first, nothing happened. But then, a crack. A faint, sharp sound that echoed like the breaking of glass. The space in front of me twisted, warping like liquid, and for a fleeting moment, I saw something. Not the room I was standing in, but something else. A glimpse of another place, another version of this world. It was as if I was looking through a crack in time itself. The crack expanded, and with it, my surroundings shifted again. The walls melted away, replaced by a vast expanse of nothingness. The feeling was overwhelming. It was like I was suspended in the middle of the universe, alone and untethered, with no past, no future. Just nothing. Then, in the distance, a shape appeared. A figure, walking toward me. As it drew closer, I could make out the outline of a person, but their face remained a blur. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as if they were aware of something I couldn't see. I tried to speak, but no words came. Instead, the figure raised a hand, and in the distance, I heard a voice. Not a sound that came from the figure, but one that came from everywhere at once. A voice that seemed to echo within me. "You thought you could escape," it said, its tone soft but laden with meaning. "You thought you could change the future. But the key only unlocks the inevitable. The path you walk is already set." I wanted to scream, to fight against the voice, but my body refused to move. The figure came closer, its shape becoming more distinct with each step. But still, its face remained hidden, obscured by some unknown force. "You cannot outrun destiny," the voice continued. "It has already claimed you. You have seen the truth, but you will never be free from it." The figure reached out, and I could feel its presence all around me, like an oppressive weight pressing down. I tried to resist, but it was as if I was drowning in its gaze. And then, suddenly, I understood. The key. The records. The shadow. Everything had led me here, to this moment. I hadn't been trying to escape the future, I had been trying to avoid the inevitable. But the truth was, I could never escape it. My life, my choices, had all been part of the same twisted design. The key had only shown me that I was already trapped, caught in the endless loop of fate. I felt the weight of it. The key, once so full of potential, now felt like an anchor, pulling me deeper into the void. I closed my eyes, surrendering to the truth that had always been there. And in that moment, I understood that the real key had never been about opening doors. It had been about accepting what was always meant to be. As I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. The space around me was silent once more. The key had disappeared from my hand, leaving me with nothing but the quiet hum of the world I was now part of. The door had closed. The future was set. And I was, at last, free. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.